A young man stands alone at the mouth of a torchlit stone corridor, deep beneath a king's palace on the island of Crete. In one hand he holds a small ball of golden thread, its end tied carefully to the doorpost beside him. Somewhere far behind him, across a wide dark sea, the city of Athens waits beneath a sky just beginning to fill with stars. A city he may never see again if the next few hours go wrong. Somewhere ahead of him, deep in the winding dark, something with the body of a man and the head of a bull is waiting too. This is Theseus, and tonight, across the next 2.5 unhurried hours, we are going to follow his entire life, from a heavy stone on a quiet beach, all the way to this torchlit doorway, and far beyond it, told so slowly and so gently that long before we reach the end, you will already be asleep. Welcome back to Boring History Narrative. If sleep is what brought you here tonight, you are exactly where you need to be. We are travelling into ancient Greece once again, this time to walk alongside Theseus, the young hero who would one day step into a labyrinth, carrying nothing but a small ball of golden thread and enough courage to face whatever waited in the darkness beyond it. You do not need to stay awake for a single word of what follows. Let your body settle into the bed beneath you. Let your breathing slow. Your only task tonight is to listen for as long as you are able, and to drift away the moment your mind is ready to. Before we begin, take one slow breath in and let it go even slower than it came. Feel your shoulders loosen. Feel the weight of your whole body sink a little further into stillness. There is nowhere else you need to be tonight, and nothing else you need to do except rest and listen. While this story carries you gently the rest of the way towards sleep, if stories like this one help you unwind at the end of a long day, consider subscribing to Boring History Narrative before you drift off tonight. It costs nothing, takes only a moment, and means a new, slow, unhurried story will already be waiting for you the next time your mind is too loud to settle on its own. Now let your eyes close, if they haven't already, and let us step back, away from that torchlit doorway for now, back many years earlier, to a quiet stretch of Greek coastline, where a king was about to leave behind far more than he understood. The king's name was Aegeus, ruler of Athens, a city that in those early years was still finding its shape, its walls not yet as grand as they would one day become, its harbour still modest compared to the great trading ports further along the coast. Aegeus had grown old without an heir, a heavy kind of loneliness for any ruler, and worse still, he carried a private fear that his own brothers, who had never fully accepted his right to the throne, would seize it the moment he was gone, leaving Athens to fall into exactly the kind of division he had spent his whole reign trying to prevent. Desperate for an answer, he had travelled to the oracle at Delphi to ask whether he would ever father a son, and had received, in return, one of those famously strange and riddling answers the oracle was known for, a warning not to loosen the mouth of his wineskin until he returned home to Athens, or he would one day die of grief. Confused by the riddle and unable to make any sense of it, Aegeus continued on to the nearby city of Troezen to ask his old friend King Pythius, a man known across Greece for his wisdom, whether he could help interpret what the oracle had truly meant. Pythius, it turned out, understood the riddle immediately, though he chose not to explain it plainly to his guest. Instead, that same night, he arranged for his own daughter, Aethra, to be brought quietly to Aegeus's chamber. Understanding exactly what kind of child such a night was likely to produce, and perhaps hoping, in his own quiet way, to tie his family's fortunes to the throne of Athens. It is a strange, slightly uncomfortable beginning to any story, arranged in secrecy by an older man's ambition, rather than by anything either young person had chosen for themselves. But it is, nonetheless, the true beginning of Theseus's story, and it shaped nearly everything that followed. Before Aegeus departed Troezen the next morning, he led Aethra to a great heavy boulder near the shore, and beneath it, he hid a sword and a pair of sandals, his own, carrying the mark of his household. If the child born of that single night turned out to be a son, he He told her she was to raise him there in Troezen, away from the danger and political scheming of Athens, and to say nothing of his true father until the boy grew strong enough to lift that stone entirely on his own. Only then, once he had proven that strength for himself, should she send him to Athens, carrying the sword and sandals as proof of who he truly was. It is worth pausing here for a moment, in the stillness of that early morning departure, a king walking away from a woman and a stone and a secret he could only hope would one day be uncovered by a son he might never live to meet. Aethra did give birth to a son, and named him Theseus. He grew up in Troezen under his grandfather Pythias's careful watch, raised, in most of the old tellings, believing his father to be the sea god Poseidon, rather than the distant Athenian king who had visited only once. A story perhaps meant kindly, to give the boy a sense of belonging to something larger, while the truth waited patiently beneath a stone by the shore. Theseus grew quickly into a strong, clever, restless young man, the kind who excelled at wrestling and running, and every physical trial the local boys competed in, but who also, even in these early years, showed a particular admiration for the stories of Hercules, whose own 12 labours had already by this point become legendary across the Greek world. It is said that young Theseus, hearing those stories told and retold around Troezen's fires, quietly decided that he too wanted a life defined by trial and struggle, rather than one handed to him easily by his grandfather's comfortable court. When Theseus turned 16, his mother finally led him to the great boulder by the shore and told him, at last, the truth his whole childhood had been quietly built around. Somewhere beneath that stone, she explained, his true father had hidden a sword and sandals, and if Theseus could lift the boulder on his own, he would finally know who he really was. The old stories describe this moment with a kind of quiet reverence. A teenage boy standing before an enormous, immovable-looking stone, his mother watching in careful silence. The whole weight of an unspoken childhood resting on whether his strength had finally caught up to the destiny waiting beneath it. Theseus planted his feet, gripped the stone's rough edges, and heaved. It did not move easily. It resisted him the way any true test should, requiring every bit of strength his young body had built, across years of wrestling and running and restless physical effort. But slowly, straining, the great boulder finally shifted, tipped, and rolled our side, revealing exactly what his mother had promised: a sword and a pair of worn leather sandals waiting patiently in the shadow of the stone for 16 years. Theseus lifted them out carefully, and in that quiet moment, standing on a familiar shore that suddenly felt entirely different, he learned that his father was not a god at all, but a mortal king, ruling a city across the water that he had never once seen. Let's rest here for one final time before we move fully into the heart of tonight's story, and imagine gently the very last quiet morning Theseus spent in Troezen before finally setting out toward the coastal road, and everything still waiting beyond it. Picture the early light spreading slowly across those familiar hillsides one last time. The same orchards and harbour he had grown up watching from his grandfather's palace. Everything exactly as it had always been, and yet already, in his own mind, beginning to feel like something he was quietly saying goodbye to. There is a particular stillness to a final, ordinary morning before a long journey begins. Every familiar sight carrying just a little more weight than usual, simply because you know, somewhere underneath the ordinary routine of it, that everything is about to change. Let that same gentle stillness settle over you now too, wherever your own rest is waiting tonight. Whatever ordinary details make up your own familiar world, they carry their own quiet worth resting inside for a while longer, before sleep. Finally, gently, carries you away from them until morning. Most young men in his position, having just discovered a sword and a path to a father's throne, might have chosen the safest way to reach it, sailing directly across the calm water, separating Troezen from Athens, a journey of only a day or two under normal conditions. his mother and grandfather certainly urged him toward exactly that option, gently reminding him of the dangerous overland road that wound instead along the coast, a route infamous across the region for the bandits and monsters who had made it their hunting ground for years, preying on travellers foolish or unlucky enough to attempt it. But Theseus, restless with the same ambition that had drawn him toward Hercules' stories his whole childhood, chose the harder road on purpose, wanting, it seems, to arrive in Athens not merely as an unknown traveller claiming a birthright, but as someone who had already proven himself worthy of it. The road proved exactly as dangerous as everyone had warned. The first threat he encountered was a bandit named Periphetes, who was said to carry an enormous bronze club and to attack travellers without warning or mercy, earning himself the frightening nickname Club Bearer among the terrified locals who lived along that stretch of coast. Theseus met him directly, and in the fight that followed, managed to wrestle the heavy club away from him entirely, using the bandit's own weapon to end the threat he had posed for so long. Rather than discarding it, Theseus kept the club afterward, carrying it with him for the remainder of his journey, a small practical trophy from his very first true test. Further along the same dangerous road, he encountered a bandit named Sinis, known by the unsettling nickname the Pine Bender, who had developed a particularly cruel method of dealing with travellers. Sinis would bend 2 tall pine trees down toward the ground, tie an unfortunate captive between them, and then release the trees suddenly, tearing the victim apart between their opposing forces. Theseus, having learned by now to meet cruelty with careful strength rather than simple recklessness, managed to overpower Sinis and subject him to precisely the same fate he had inflicted on so many innocent travellers before him. A harsh justice, but one the old stories treat as entirely fitting given everything that had come before it. The road continued to test him. Near the region of Crommyon, he encountered a wild and monstrous sow that had been terrorising local farmers, in some tellings said to be the mother of the very Erymanthian boar that Hercules himself would later face in his own labours, a small thread connecting the two heroes' stories even this early. Theseus hunted and killed the creature, freeing the region from a danger it had lived under for some time. Not long after, he faced a bandit named Sciron, who forced travellers to wash his feet at the edge of a high sea cliff, and then kicked them over the edge into the water below, where, according to the old tellings, an enormous turtle waited to finish what the fall itself had started. Theseus, refusing to kneel for the man, instead seized him and threw him from his own cliff, ending that particular danger the same way it had claimed so many lives before his arrival. 2 further trials waited before Athens finally came into view. A wrestler named Cercion, who challenged every traveller to a match to the death, and had never once been defeated, met Theseus on the road, and for the first time in his long, cruel career, found himself thrown and killed by an opponent stronger and more determined than himself. And finally, perhaps the strangest and most memorable of all these early trials, Theseus encountered a man named Procrustes, who kept an iron bed at his roadside home and offered weary travellers a place to rest for the night. But Procrustes' hospitality carried a terrible catch. If a guest was too short for the bed, he would stretch them forcibly to fit it, and if they were too tall, he would cut away whatever portion of them extended past its edges. Theseus, understanding the trap for exactly what it was, forced Procrustes onto his own iron bed instead, and gave him precisely the same treatment he had given so many others. By the time Theseus finally reached the outskirts of Athens, he had rid an entire dangerous stretch of coastline of 6 separate threats, arriving not as an unknown young stranger, but as someone whose reputation, remarkably, had already begun travelling ahead of him along the same road he had just cleared. It is worth pausing here for a moment, in the quiet space just before he enters the city that would define the rest of his life. He had proven, Through 6 difficult trials, exactly the kind of strength and determination his childhood hero, Hercules, was already famous for, and yet the greatest test of his life, the one this whole story has been slowly walking toward, still waited months ahead of him, across the sea, in a kingdom called Crete. Let's go back for a moment to those early years in Trozen, before the boulder, before the sword, because that quiet childhood shaped more of Theseus's later life than the old stories always pause to mention. Trozen itself was a small peaceful city on the coast of the Peloponnese, known even then for a certain gentle prosperity, orchards and olive groves spreading across its hillsides. A harbour busy enough to bring news and travellers from across the wider Greek world without ever growing large enough to feel like a true city in the way Athens or Corinth already did. Pythias, Theseus's grandfather, was remembered by later Greek writers as one of the wisest rulers of his generation. A man whose court attracted scholars and travellers eager to hear his judgments on difficult disputes. And it was in the middle of that same thoughtful, unhurried household that young Theseus spent his earliest years, aware from very early on that he was somehow different from the other boys he trained alongside, though not yet understanding exactly why. It is said that Theseus's mother Aethra kept the truth of his parentage carefully guarded, not out of any desire to deceive her son, but out of a genuine fear for his safety. Understanding that a claim to the Athenian throne, even an unconfirmed one, could easily draw the attention of enemies long before the boy was strong enough to protect himself. And so young Theseus grew up believing, as so many children in that world did, a comforting story about his own origins, that his true father was the great sea god Poseidon himself. A story that, whether or not he ever fully believed it, seemed to settle into him as a kind of quiet confidence, a sense that he belonged to something larger than the small, peaceful city he was being raised in. His days followed the same rhythm most noble children of that era knew well, wrestling and running in the mornings under the watchful instruction of local trainers. Long afternoons spent listening to travelling storytellers and visiting scholars share news and legend from across the Greek world. Evenings spent at his grandfather's table, listening quietly, while older men debated questions of justice and governance that would, though he could not have known it yet, shape the very qualities that made him such an effective and thoughtful ruler decades later. It was during these long evenings, more than during any of his physical training, that young Theseus first began absorbing the patient, careful way his grandfather approached even the most difficult decisions, weighing every side carefully before ever settling on a judgment, a habit of mind that would serve him well through everything still ahead. The stories of Hercules reached Trozen the way most great stories travelled in that era, carried by merchants and wandering singers who passed through the city's harbour from time to time, each one adding fresh details, sometimes contradicting details heard from the last traveller, to an already sprawling legend of impossible labours and monstrous trials. Young Theseus, listening to these stories with the same rapt attention most children reserve for their earliest heroes, is said to have privately begun comparing himself against each new labour as he heard it described, wondering, in the quiet way children sometimes wonder about their own future, whether he too might one day be called towards something as difficult and as meaningful. It would be several more years yet before he ever learned just how literally that childhood wondering would eventually be answered. Let's slow down here for a while too, before we continue any further, and rest a little longer in this quiet space just before Theseus departs Trozen for the very first time. There is a particular bittersweet quality to the moment any young person leaves the only home they have ever known, and it is worth imagining, gently, what that morning must have felt like for both Theseus and his mother, standing together beside that now empty hollow where the boulder had rested for 16 years. Sword and sandals finally in hand, an entire unfamiliar life waiting somewhere across the water. Aethra, watching her son prepare to leave, must have carried her own complicated mixture of pride and fear. Having raised him carefully in relative safety for so many years, only to finally reveal the truth that would immediately place him in danger, first along that treacherous coastal road, and then, though she could not have known it yet, inside a labyrinth far more dangerous than any bandit. It is the particular ache every parent eventually faces, watching a child step forward into exactly the kind of difficulty they had spent years quietly trying to protect them from, understanding that protection itself has limits, that eventually every young person must walk their own difficult road, however much a parent might wish to walk it for them instead. Let that same gentle ache settle over you now too. If it resonates with anything in your own life, any goodbye you've had to say, any moment you've watched someone you love step forward into their own uncertain future. There is nothing to resolve in that feeling right now. No action required. Simply let it rest alongside you for a while. The way Aethra's own quiet worry must have rested alongside her that entire morning. Present, but not overwhelming. A parent's love, finding its own way to hold both pride and fear at exactly the same time. If tonight's unhurried pace continues to ease you towards sleep, remember that boring history narrative always builds its stories this way, patient, layered, more interested in these quiet human moments than in rushing past them toward the next dramatic event. A subscription costs nothing and ensures a story like this one is always waiting for you. Now let's continue following Theseus down that same coastal road his mother watched him disappear along that morning. Let's slow down for a moment here too, before we continue further into the story, and rest a while in the quiet, unhurried atmosphere of that small coastal city. Picture Trozen at dusk, the way it must have looked to a young Theseus finishing an evening's training, orchards turning gold and then grey in the fading light, the distant sound of the harbour settling into its nighttime quiet, a handful of lamps beginning to glow warmly in windows across the hillside as families gathered in for the evening. There is a particular gentle stillness to a small coastal town at dusk, one that has probably changed very little in the thousands of years since Theseus himself might have watched the same kind of evening settle over the same stretch of coastline. Let that same gentle stillness settle over you now too, wherever you happen to be resting tonight. If tonight's slower, more detailed pace is helping you unwind, remember that boring history narrative always builds its stories exactly this way, layered and unhurried, more interested in the quiet spaces between events than in rushing past them. A subscription costs nothing and ensures a new story like this one is waiting whenever you need it. Now, let's return to the coastal road Theseus chose to walk toward Athens, and look a little more closely at the dangers waiting along it. It is worth remembering, as we return to that dangerous stretch of coastline, that the region Theseus was walking through was not some distant wilderness, but the very heartland of what would one day become classical Greece. The same hills and coastal paths that later philosophers and poets would walk along on their own journeys between cities. In Theseus's time, though, this same stretch of coast had earned a fearsome reputation, precisely because it connected several important settlements, making it a route that travellers and traders had little choice but to use despite its dangers, and one that the region's various bandits had learned to exploit precisely because of the steady stream of vulnerable travellers passing through. Periphetes, the very first threat Theseus encountered, was said in some tellings to be a son of the smith god Hephaestus, which the old storytellers used to explain his unusual skill in forging the heavy bronze club he wielded so effectively against travellers before Theseus finally took it from him. Sinis, the second bandit, held a particularly feared reputation, not just for his cruelty but for his surprising physical strength, said to be able to bend fully grown pine trees down to the ground, using nothing but his own bare hands. a strength that made the encounter with Theseus a genuinely uncertain contest rather than an easy victory. It is worth remembering, listening to these old trials now, that Theseus was still a very young man during this journey, not yet fully grown into the legendary strength his later years would be remembered for, making each of these 6 encounters a genuine test of a young man's courage and cleverness, rather than simply another display of an already established hero's overwhelming power. There is a little more worth knowing too, about the wider world Theseus was walking through on this journey, because the Isthmus of Corinth, the narrow stretch of land connecting the Peloponnese to mainland Greece that his dangerous road ran directly through, was one of the most strategically important and heavily travelled corridors in the entire ancient Greek world, which is likely part of why it had attracted so many dangerous bandits in the first place. A steady stream of merchants and travellers passing through made for a reliable, if morally repugnant, source of victims for anyone willing to prey on them. This same narrow stretch of land would, centuries after Theseus's own lifetime, become home to the Isthmian Games, one of the 4 great pan-Hellenic athletic festivals of the ancient Greek world, held in the very region Theseus had once cleared of its worst dangers. Ancient tradition credited Theseus himself with founding these games, in honour of the trials he had faced and overcome along that same road, a small, lasting echo of his own journey, woven permanently into the athletic calendar of the wider Greek world for centuries afterward. It is a fitting kind of legacy, athletes gathering for generations afterward to compete and celebrate in the very place where a young, untested hero had once walked alone, uncertain of his own strength, fighting for nothing more than the chance to survive long enough to meet a father he had never known. Let this same sense of transformation settle over you for a moment now too. The way a road once defined entirely by danger and fear eventually became, through nothing more than the passage of years and the patient work of memory, a place of celebration and gathering instead. Whatever difficulty a particular place or time in your own life once held, it does not have to remain defined by that difficulty forever. Time has a quiet way of transforming even the hardest roads into something worth remembering more gently. There is one more detail from this journey worth adding here. Something easy to pass over quickly, given everything else happening along that dangerous road. Before Theseus ever reached Sirchion, the deadly wrestler who had never once lost a match, he passed through a small farming village, where an elderly woman offered him a simple meal and a place to rest for the night, having heard already, through word travelling faster than he himself could walk, about the young stranger clearing the road of its worst dangers one bandit at a time. She warned him, over that humble meal, about Sirchion's true nature, that the wrestler had grown so confident in his own unbeaten record that he had taken to mocking each new challenger before their match even began. A small detail that later helped Theseus recognize and stay calm through the wrestler's attempts to unsettle him with words before the physical contest even started. It's a small, easily forgotten moment in the larger sweep of this story, an old woman's simple kindness and a stranger's careful warning, but it reflects something true about how these old legends actually spread and grew across the ancient world, not as single, fictitious narratives, but as living stories passed traveller to traveller, farmer to farmer, each person adding whatever small detail or warning felt most useful to share, until the version that finally reached any given listener carried within it the accumulated care of dozens of people who had never met the hero at the centre of it, but who wanted, in their own small way, to help him succeed anyway. By the time Theseus finally faced Procrustes, the last and strangest of his 6 trials, word of his approach had apparently spread even to that isolated roadside home, and it is said that Procrustes, unusually for him, hesitated before offering his usual false hospitality, some old tellings suggesting he sensed, even before recognizing his visitor, that this particular traveller was unlike anyone who had rested on his terrible iron bed before. Whether or not that hesitation was ever real, it did not change the outcome. Theseus, having grown steadily more confident and more perceptive across 5 previous trials, saw through the trap immediately and ended, that same evening, one of the cruelest recurring dangers the entire coastal road had ever known. Athens, when Theseus finally arrived, was not the city he might have imagined growing up in Troezen, hearing only distant, second-hand descriptions of it. It was smaller than the legends suggested, its buildings modest, its streets narrow and dusty, its king, his own father, growing older and more anxious with each passing year, still without any clear, trusted heir to leave his throne to. Aegeus, unaware that the dusty, travel-worn young stranger who had just arrived in his city was his own son, had by this point remarried to a woman named Medea, the same Medea who, in an entirely different chapter of Greek mythology, had once helped Jason retrieve the Golden Fleece before their own relationship ended in tragedy and betrayal. Medea, possessing certain magical abilities the old stories never shy away from, recognized immediately who this new arrival truly was and understood, just as quickly, exactly what his presence threatened. She had a young son of her own by Aegeus, and every hope she carried for that son's future rested entirely on Theseus never being recognized as the king's true heir. And so, rather than allowing the truth to surface naturally, Medea convinced Aegeus that this powerful, unfamiliar young stranger was dangerous, a threat to the throne rather than its rightful heir, and persuaded the aging, anxious king to poison him quietly at a welcoming feast before the truth could ever come to light. The feast was arranged, and Theseus, still unrecognized, sat down to dine with the father he had travelled so far and endured so much to finally meet. It is said that as the poisoned cup was being prepared to be offered to him, Theseus drew his sword, the very sword his mother had helped him lift from beneath that heavy boulder so many months before, intending simply to cut a piece of meat before him. Aegeus's eyes fell on that sword, and recognition swept over him all at once, the same sword he himself had hidden beneath a stone in Troezen 16 years earlier, now sitting in the hand of the very stranger he had just agreed to poison. In a single desperate motion, the old king knocked the poisoned cup from Theseus's hand before it could ever reach his lips, spilling it harmlessly across the floor, and pulled his newfound son into an embrace that undid, in one overwhelming moment, 16 years of separation and uncertainty. Medea, her plot exposed and her position in Athens no longer safe, fled the city shortly after, disappearing into the wider world of Greek legend to continue her own separate, complicated story elsewhere. Theseus, meanwhile, was finally welcomed publicly as Aegeus's son and heir, a recognition that should have settled, at long last, into a period of quiet, well-earned peace. But peace, as this story has already shown more than once, rarely lasted long in these old tellings, and Theseus's arrival in Athens had already stirred jealousy among Aegeus's brothers and their many sons, who had long assumed the throne would eventually fall to one of them in the old king's absence of any heir. A brief, tense conflict followed, as these rival cousins attempted to seize the city before Theseus could be firmly established as its future ruler. But Theseus, drawing on the same strength and cleverness that had carried him safely down that dangerous coastal road, defeated their attempted uprising and secured his place beside his father. With that immediate danger settled, Theseus turned his attention to one further task before the story's true central labour could even begin. A wild and destructive bull, the very same Cretan bull that Hercules had once wrestled and released years earlier as one of his 12 labours, had made its way north from where it had eventually wandered after its release, and had settled near the town of Marathon, terrorising the surrounding countryside exactly the way it once had on Crete. Theseus travelled to Marathon himself, and using the same calm, patient strength his childhood hero had once shown, captured the bull and brought it safely back to Athens, where it was sacrificed in gratitude to the gods. It was a smaller trial compared to what still waited ahead of him, but a meaningful one nonetheless. A quiet echo connecting his own growing legend to the hero whose stories had first inspired him as a restless boy back in Trozen. It was not long after this that the true weight of the story ahead of him finally became clear, carried into Athens not by any monster or bandit, but by a quiet, dreaded ritual the city had been forced into years before Theseus had ever arrived, a tribute owed to a distant island kingdom, paid not in gold or grain, but in the lives of Athens' own young sons and daughters. There is one more quiet detail worth adding from Theseus's arrival in Athens, easy to overlook amid the drama of the poisoned cup and the sudden recognition that followed it. Before that dramatic feast ever took place, Theseus is said to have spent his first few days in the city simply observing quietly, choosing not to reveal his identity immediately, even after arriving wanting, in his own careful way, to understand the true state of his father's court before stepping into the middle of whatever tensions and rivalries had taken root there during his long years of absence. This small detail reveals something meaningful about how Theseus approached even this most personal of moments, the same patient caution he had shown throughout his journey down that dangerous coastal road, gathering information carefully before committing to any significant action. It would have been simpler in some ways to announce himself immediately upon arrival. Sword and sandals held high as immediate proof of his identity. Instead, he chose the harder, more patient path, watching quietly first. Understanding the dangers Medea's influence posed before ever revealing himself directly to a father who might, without that careful observation, have been too thoroughly under her sway to protect him from the very poisoning she was already quietly arranging. It is a small, easily missed example of the same careful, patient strength that defined so much of his life. Worth sitting with for a moment now, as this part of the story continues. Sometimes the most important preparation for a difficult moment is not dramatic action at all, but quiet, patient observation. Taking the time to truly understand a situation before ever stepping fully into the middle of it. Let's spend a little more time too with Ariadne before we leave her introduction behind, because her own life inside the Cretan palace deserves a slower telling than we gave it earlier. She had grown up as one of several children of King Minos and Queen Pasiphae, raised amid genuine wealth and comfort, the daughter of one of the most powerful rulers in the entire Aegean world, and yet her childhood had never been entirely free of the quiet, unspoken shadow cast by her own mother's curse, and the strange, hidden half-brother it had produced. Ancient tellings suggest she grew up keenly intelligent and thoughtful, trained alongside her siblings in the courtly education expected of Cretan royalty, but carrying beneath that comfortable upbringing an early awareness of just how much cruelty her own family's power depended on maintaining. It is easy, in the flow of this larger story, to focus only on the dramatic moment she first saw Theseus and felt that sudden pull toward him, but it is worth remembering that her decision to help him was never simply about romantic feeling alone. She had watched, for years, tribute after tribute arrive from Athens, 14 frightened young strangers delivered into a maze from which none ever returned, and had carried that quiet horror inside her the entire time, unable, as a princess bound by her own father's authority, to do anything meaningful to stop it. Theseus's arrival offered her, for the first time, not just a romantic possibility, but a genuine chance to finally act against a cruelty she had been forced to watch helplessly for years. That context matters, sitting with this story now, because it transforms her choice from a simple fairy tale romance into something braver and more complicated. A young woman risking everything she had ever known, her family, her home, her own safety, not only for the sake of a stranger she had just met, but for the sake of finally ending a horror her own silence had, in her own mind, made her quietly complicit for years. Whatever came afterward on that quiet shore at Naxos, her choice to help Theseus in the first place remains one of the genuinely courageous acts at the centre of this entire story. Let's linger a while longer in Athens too, before we move on toward Crete, because the city Theseus arrived in deserves a slower telling than we gave it earlier tonight. Athens, at this point in its history, was ruled from a fortified hilltop that would, many centuries later, become famous across the entire world as the Acropolis. Though in Theseus's time it held none of the marble temples later generations would come to associate with that name. Only simpler, older structures, a modest royal residence, storerooms, and defensive walls built from rough-cut stone rather than the polished marble that later Athenian wealth would eventually afford. Below that hilltop, the city itself spread out in a loose collection of homes and workshops, potters and weavers and metalworkers, each occupying their own quarter. Narrow streets winding between them without any of the careful planning later Greek cities would become known for. It was into this smaller, rougher version of Athens that Theseus arrived, travel-worn and still carrying the club he had taken from Periphetes days earlier, and it is worth imagining for a moment what he must have looked like to the ordinary Athenians who first saw him passing through their streets, a broad-shouldered young stranger, clearly capable, clearly weathered by recent hardship, moving with the particular quiet confidence of someone who has already proven himself against real danger. Word of the road's sudden safety, 6 long-standing threats eliminated in the span of just a few days, had likely reached the city before he had, and it is easy to imagine a low murmur of curiosity following him through those narrow streets, ordinary citizens wondering aloud who this capable young stranger might be. Long before the dramatic revelation at his father's own feast finally answered that question for everyone at once, Aegeus's court, when Theseus finally reached it, reflected the same uncertain, anxious atmosphere that had settled over the aging king's entire reign. Advisors and extended family members, each quietly positioning themselves for whatever uncertain succession might eventually follow his death. Alliances forming and dissolving in the particular careful, watchful way that surrounds any ruler without a clear, confirmed heir. Medea's own position within that court had always rested on exactly this uncertainty. Her influence over Aegeus, and by extension her son's own eventual claim to the throne, depending entirely on no stronger rival ever emerging to challenge it. It is worth understanding her actions not simply as villainy for its own sake, but as the desperate calculation of someone whose entire position, and her own son's entire future, suddenly depended on eliminating a threat she alone had the insight to recognize the moment he walked into that grand hall. Let's spend a little more time too with King Pythias before we move on, because his wisdom shaped this entire story more than the old tellings always paused to credit fully. Ancient writers remembered him as one of the most learned rulers of his generation, said to have written early treatises on the art of rhetoric, on how to speak persuasively and reason carefully through difficult questions, knowledge that would have surrounded Theseus throughout his entire childhood, absorbed gradually through years of listening, rather than through any single deliberate lesson. It is easy to imagine, sitting with this detail now, exactly how much of Theseus's own later effectiveness. First in navigating the tense, dangerous politics of Aegeus's court, and later in the patient work of unifying Attica, must have grown from these early years spent absorbing his grandfather's careful, deliberate way of thinking through difficult problems. Strength alone, however considerable his own physical strength eventually became, was never truly the quality that carried Theseus through his hardest trials. It was this quieter, less dramatic inheritance from Pythias, the habit of thinking carefully before acting, of weighing every side of a difficult situation, that proved, again and again across his long life, to be just as valuable as any sword or any strength of arm, let this same thought settle over you gently now too. The reminder that the most valuable things we carry forward from our own upbringing are often not the dramatic lessons we remember clearly, but the quiet, patient habits absorbed gradually over years of simply being present around people who modelled them consistently. Whatever patient wisdom shaped your own life, wherever it came from, it continues quietly working inside you, the same steady, unglamorous way Pythias's own careful thinking continued working inside Theseus long after he had left Trojan behind. Let's spend a final quiet moment too, with the 6 trials Theseus faced along that coastal road, before we move fully past them tonight and consider what they meant together as a whole, rather than simply as 6 separate encounters strung one after another. Each bandit he faced represented a different kind of cruelty, brute violence with Periphetes' heavy club, calculated torment with Sinis' bent pine trees, simple predatory danger with the wild Crommyonian sow, false hospitality turned deadly with Sirion's cliffside trap, competitive pride twisted into murder with Cercyon's endless wrestling matches, and finally, with Procrustes, perhaps the strangest cruelty of all, a rigid insistence that every conform exactly to a single fixed measure, regardless of the harm that forcing required. Taken together, these 6 trials read almost like a careful education in the many different shapes cruelty can take, preparing Theseus, whether he understood it this way himself at the time or not, for the far greater trial still waiting for him across the sea, a labyrinth built by a father's shame, guarded by a suffering born of curse rather than choice, demanding tribute paid in the lives of frightened children. By the time Theseus finally stood at that torchlit doorway in Crete, he had already learned, through 6 separate encounters, that danger rarely announces itself honestly. That cruelty often wears the mask of ordinary hospitality or simple rules or wounded pride, and that meeting it successfully required not just strength, but careful attention to exactly what kind of danger he was actually facing in each new situation. Let this same careful attention rest alongside you now too, as tonight's story continues its slow, unhurried journey toward its own quiet end. Whatever different shapes difficulty has taken in your own recent days, know that meeting each one clearly, understanding its particular nature, rather than treating every challenge exactly the same way, is itself its own quiet, patient kind of strength, the same strength that carried a young, untested traveller safely down an entire road built from 6 very different dangers. The tribute itself dated back years earlier, to a war Athens had fought and lost against the powerful island kingdom of Crete, ruled by King Minos, a war that had ended, among other terms, with a punishing agreement that Athens would send 14 of its own young people, 7 young men and 7 young women, across the sea to Crete every 9 years, to be delivered into the heart of a labyrinth built beneath the king's palace at Knossos, where a creature known as the Minotaur waited to receive them. The Minotaur's own origin carried its own strange and uncomfortable history, tied to an old insult King Minos had once given the sea god Poseidon, refusing to sacrifice a magnificent white bull the god had sent him, keeping the beautiful animal for himself instead of honouring his promise. Poseidon's punishment had been unusual and cruel in equal measure, cursing Minos' own wife, Queen Pasiphae, with an unnatural passion for that same white bull, a curse that eventually resulted in the birth of a creature with the body of a man and the head of a bull, half human, half monster, belonging fully to neither world. Ashamed and unsettled by what had been born into his own household, Minos commissioned a brilliant craftsman named Daedalus to construct an enormous, deliberately confusing labyrinth beneath his palace. A maze so complex that anyone who entered it would become hopelessly lost long before they ever found their way back out. And there, in that endless maze of stone corridors, the Minotaur was kept fed when the appointed years arrived by their tribute demanded from conquered Athens. Word reached Athens that the 9th year had come around once again, and that the terrible selection of 14 young tributes was about to begin, chosen either by lottery or, in some tellings, by whatever cruel method the grieving city had settled into over the years since the tradition first began. Theseus, newly recognised as Aegeus's son and heir, watched the fear and grief settle over the city as families waited anxiously to learn whose children would be taken this time, and something in him, the same restless determination that had carried him down that dangerous coastal road and driven him to seek out difficult trials rather than easy ones, decided immediately that he could not simply stand aside and watch this happen again. He volunteered himself as one of the 7 young men against his father's desperate pleading. Aegeus, having only just found his son after 16 years of separation, begged him not to go, reminding him that no tribute sent to that labyrinth had ever once returned, that this was not a bandit on a dangerous road or a wild bull terrorizing a countryside, but something else entirely, an ancient curse given monstrous shape, kept alive inside a maze specifically designed, so that no one, however strong or clever, could ever hope to find their own way back out of it. But Theseus, having already built an entire young life around seeking out exactly this kind of impossible trial, would not be talked out of it. He promised his father one thing before he sailed, that the ship carrying the tributes always travelled under black sails, a mark of mourning for the children it carried toward near certain death, but that if he survived and returned successfully, he would order the sailors to raise white sails instead on the journey home, so that Aegeus, watching anxiously from the cliffs above Athens, would know from a great distance whether his son was alive, long before the ship ever reached the harbour. With that promise made, and his father's fear only partly eased by it, Theseus boarded the black-sailed ship alongside the other 13 young Athenians and set sail across the sea toward Crete, toward a labyrinth, a monster, and a golden thread waiting, though he did not yet know it, in the hands of someone who was about to change the entire shape of his fate. If you have been listening closely so far, take a moment now to let your attention loosen a little. Boring history narrative is built for exactly this kind of unwinding, so if your mind is starting to drift, that is not a sign you are missing anything important. It is simply the story doing exactly what it was made to do. Feel the weight of your body settling further into the mattress beneath you. Let your breathing slow, in through the nose, slow and easy, and out even slower still. There is no test waiting for you at the end of this story, no detail you need to hold on to tightly. You can simply let it move through you, the way warm water moves through open hands, most of it slipping quietly away, only a little of it needing to stay. If this kind of unhurried storytelling is helping you relax tonight, a subscription to Boring History Narrative costs nothing and takes only a moment, and it means a new slow journey through history will be waiting for you the next time sleep doesn't come easily. Now let's continue gently across the sea toward Crete, where the true heart of Theseus's story is waiting. The voyage from Athens to Crete took several days, the black-sailed ship moving steadily across open water under a wide Mediterranean sky, carrying its 14 young passengers toward a fate none of them could fully imagine. It is worth imagining for a moment what those days aboard ship must have felt like: salt air and creaking timber, the coastline of home slowly shrinking behind them, replaced eventually by nothing but open water in every direction, and then gradually the distant outline of an unfamiliar island rising slowly out of the horizon ahead. Crete, when it finally came into view, was larger and more impressive than most of the young Athenians aboard had ever expected. Its harbour, busy with ships from across the Mediterranean world, its palace at Knossos, visible, even from a distance, sprawling and enormous, built across so many connected halls and courtyards that it was said, even before anyone mentioned the labyrinth hidden beneath it, that a person could easily lose their way simply wandering its upper floors. The 14 young tributes were led ashore under guard and brought before King Minos himself, a stern, imposing ruler whose face carried the particular weariness of a man who had spent years enforcing a tradition he had perhaps come, in his own private moments, to feel some quiet discomfort over, even if he never once let that discomfort show publicly. It was there, standing before the king in that grand hall, that Theseus first saw Ariadne, the king's own daughter, watching the newly arrived tributes with an expression that held far more than simple royal curiosity. The old stories describe what happened next simply, and perhaps that simplicity is part of what has made it endure so long in memory. That Ariadne, seeing Theseus among the frightened, exhausted young Athenians standing before her father's throne, felt something shift immediately inside her, a sudden, powerful pull toward this particular stranger among the 14. She had grown up surrounded by the Labyrinth's quiet horror, her entire life aware, in the way children often are, of the darker undercurrents running beneath their own household, of exactly what waited in the maze beneath her family's palace, and of exactly what happened to everyone sent into it. And now, watching this new group of tributes, her attention settled entirely on one young man whose calm, steady bearing seemed different from the quiet despair carried by the 13 others beside him. That night, according to the old tellings, Ariadne found a way to approach Theseus privately, away from her father's watchful court, and made him an offer that would change everything that followed. She would help him survive the labyrinth and defeat the creature waiting inside it if he would promise, in return, to take her away from Crete with him afterward. Away from a father and a household she had grown increasingly desperate to escape. Theseus agreed without hesitation, and Ariadne, drawing on knowledge she had gathered over years of living above that same maze, and on a clever suggestion given to her, in most tellings, by Daedalus himself, the very craftsman who had built the labyrinth and understood its winding logic better than anyone alive, gave Theseus a simple, small object that would prove more valuable than any weapon he could have carried into that darkness. A ball of golden thread. This was, Ariadne explained quietly, the only true solution to a maze built specifically to defeat memory and direction alike. Daedalus, when Ariadne had gone to him privately for help, had told her that the labyrinth's danger was never really about fighting whatever waited inside it. Plenty of strong men could likely have matched the Minotaur in a direct struggle, but about finding a way back out afterward, through a maze deliberately designed to erase any sense of the path already walked. His solution was elegant in its simplicity. Tie one end of a long thread to the entrance, unwind it slowly with every turn taken deeper into the maze, and when the moment came to leave, simply follow that same thread back the way it had come. No memory required, no clever tracking of turns, just a slow, patient retracing of a path already physically marked. Theseus accepted the thread with quiet gratitude, understanding immediately how much it would matter once he was standing alone in that darkness. Before the appointed morning arrived, when the tributes would finally be led down into the labyrinth's entrance, Ariadne gave him one more piece of guidance, whispered quickly in the last private moment they had together. The Minotaur, she told him, though monstrous and powerful, was still, in some deep sense, a creature born of confusion and shame, kept in darkness his entire life, fed only through cruelty rather than any true care. Theseus would need real courage to face him, she warned, but courage alone would not be enough. He would need patience too, the same steady, unhurried patience that had carried him safely down that dangerous coastal road months earlier, waiting for the right moment rather than rushing blindly into the dark. As dawn broke over Knossos on the appointed morning, the 14 young Athenians were led down through the palace's lower levels, past guards who watched them with expressions caught somewhere between practiced indifference and quiet, uncomfortable pity, toward a heavy stone doorway set into the palace's foundations, the entrance to the labyrinth itself. Torches lined the corridor just inside, their light flickering weakly against walls carved with strange, disorienting patterns meant, it was said, to further confuse anyone who tried to memorize their surroundings. The other 13 tributes were led in first, disappearing one by one into that flickering darkness, their fear plainly visible even in the dim torchlight. Theseus, waiting his turn near the entrance, felt the small, solid weight of the golden thread in his hand, tied it carefully to the heavy stone doorpost exactly as Ariadne had instructed, and stepped, finally, into the dark corridor beyond it. This is exactly where our story began tonight, at this same torchlit doorway. A young man standing at the edge of an ancient maze, one hand steady on a small ball of golden thread, everything he had survived to reach this moment now behind him. And everything still waiting to happen, still hidden somewhere ahead in the winding dark. We will follow him the rest of the way into that labyrinth, and everything that follows it in the next part of tonight's story. For now, let your own breathing settle further, slow and unhurried, the same steady rhythm Theseus himself was lightly holding on to as he took his first careful steps into the dark. Before we follow Theseus any further into that dark maze, it's worth pausing for a moment on the man who built it, because Daedalus's own story carries its own quiet sadness, tucked just beneath the surface of this larger one. He had once been a celebrated craftsman in Athens itself, inventive and brilliant, but was forced to flee the city years earlier after a bitter rivalry with his own nephew, a talented young apprentice whose growing skill Daedalus had come to resent, ending in tragedy that the old stories treat with careful discretion. He found refuge eventually in Crete, welcomed into King Minos' court for his obvious talent, and it was there that he was eventually commissioned to build the Labyrinth, a project so successful in its confusing design that Minos, once it was finished, is said to have grown suddenly wary of letting its creator leave the island at all. Fearing he might reveal its secrets elsewhere, Daedalus, along with his young son Icarus, found himself effectively trapped on Crete by his own genius, unable to leave by sea since Minos controlled every ship and harbour across the island. In a separate later chapter of this same broader mythology, Daedalus would eventually attempt an escape by an entirely different route, constructing wings of feathers and wax for himself and his son, and flying free from the island altogether, a story that ends, in most tellings, in its own quiet tragedy when young Icarus, ignoring his father's careful warnings, flew too close to the sun and fell into the sea below. But that particular sorrow belonged to a time still ahead of the events unfolding in the labyrinth on this particular morning, and for now, Daedalus remained quietly present in Crete, his intricate maze doing exactly what he had designed it to do, confusing everyone who entered it except, this time, for the one young man carrying a length of golden thread that Daedalus himself had quietly suggested. Let's rest here for a moment, in this in-between space, before the next part of tonight's story carries us the rest of the way through the labyrinth. If your mind has been wandering along with this story, drifting in and out the way minds often do late at night, that is exactly as it should be. There is no need to hold on to every detail, every name, every twist of this long and layered mythology. Let it become soft and distant now, a low, steady hum in the background, the same way a familiar voice in another room slowly fades as sleep finally arrives. Picture, if it helps, that same torchlit corridor Theseus is standing inside right now, cool stone walls, the small orange glow of torchlight, and utter, complete silence beyond it, waiting. That same quiet is available to you too, right now, in whatever room you're resting in. If tonight's story is helping your own mind finally slow down after a long day, remember that Boring History Narrative uploads a new, slow, unhurried journey through history every week. Always built the same unhurried way. Always meant to be listened to exactly like this, half awake, half already dreaming. A quick subscribe before you drift off means you'll never have to search for a story like this one again when you need it most. For now, though, There is nothing else required of you. Rest here a while longer, in the quiet space just outside a labyrinth, before we finally step through it together in the next part of tonight's story. Welcome back to Boring History Narrative and to the second part of tonight's slow journey through the life of Theseus. If you're joining partway through or drifting back in after resting through part of the last section, that's perfectly fine. We left Theseus standing just inside the entrance of the Cretan labyrinth, a small ball of golden thread in one hand, its other end tied securely to the doorpost behind him, about to step forward into a darkness that had never once released anyone who entered it. Let's rejoin him there now, gently, and continue the story together. The corridor beyond the entrance narrowed quickly, torchlight from the doorway fading behind him, within only a few dozen steps, replaced by a deeper, heavier darkness that seemed to swallow sound as thoroughly as it swallowed light. Theseus moved carefully, one hand trailing the golden thread out behind him, unwinding steadily from the ball as he walked, the other hand resting on the hilt of the sword his mother had once helped him lift from beneath a stone in Trajan. The walls around him were rough-cut stone, carved here and there with strange, disorienting patterns that seemed, in the flickering edge of what little light remained, to shift and rearrange themselves the longer he looked at them, exactly the kind of confusion Daedalus had designed the entire maze to produce. The passage forked again and again, sometimes doubling back on itself in ways that would have been impossible to track without the thread steadily unwinding behind him, sometimes narrowing so tightly that Theseus had to turn sideways to continue forward at all. He passed, in places, what appeared to be old bones scattered across the stone floor, the quiet, grim evidence of tributes who had come this way before him and never found their way back out, a detail the old stories rarely dwell on for long, but one that must have settled heavily over anyone actually walking through it in the flickering dark, and became difficult to measure inside that maze. There was no daylight to mark its passage, no familiar landmark to judge distance by, only the steady unwinding of golden thread behind him, and the slow, careful rhythm of his own footsteps against ancient stone. It is easy, imagining this part of the story, to feel a kind of sympathetic exhaustion settle over you too, the particular tiredness of moving forward through unfamiliar darkness with no clear sense of how much further there is left to go. If that feeling is settling over you right now, let it. There is nowhere else you need to be tonight either, and no clear endpoint you need to reach before you're allowed to rest deep within the maze. Theseus began to hear something ahead of him in the darkness, a low, heavy breathing, deeper and rougher than any human breath, echoing faintly off unseen stone walls, somewhere further along the winding passage. He slowed his pace, drawing his sword fully now, moving as quietly as the uneven stone floor allowed, following both the thread trailing from his hand and the sound growing steadily louder ahead of him. And then, rounding one final turn in that endless maze, the corridor opened suddenly into a wider chamber, and there, in the near-total darkness, Theseus finally saw the Minotaur. Let's go back for a moment to the labyrinth itself, and spend a little longer inside its winding dark corridors than we did the first time through, because there is more worth sitting with in that long quiet walk than the fight that eventually waited at its centre. Imagine the particular quality of darkness inside a maze built entirely of stone, deep enough beneath a palace that no natural light could ever reach it, the air cool and faintly damp, carrying with it the mingled smell of old stone and old torch smoke and something else beneath it, something the 14 tributes led in ahead of Theseus would have recognised immediately as fear, their own and each other's, thick enough in that enclosed space to feel almost physical. Theseus moved through those corridors more slowly than a purely fearful traveller might have, pausing occasionally to listen, to feel his way along a wall, when the darkness grew too complete to trust his eyes at all. the golden thread unwinding steadily behind him the entire time, a small, quiet reassurance in an otherwise disorienting darkness. It is said that the maze itself seemed to shift and change the longer anyone spent inside it, not through any literal magic, but through the simple, dizzying effect of identical stone corridors branching again and again in ways that made even a short distance feel impossibly long, and made backtracking, without some reliable guide like Theseus's thread, essentially impossible for anyone who attempted it, somewhere deep within that maze, separated from the other tributes by corridors that had already forked and rejoined several times over. Theseus began noticing small signs that he was drawing closer to whatever waited at the labyrinth's centre. Faint scratches along certain stone walls, a change in the quality of the air, growing slightly warmer and heavier the further he walked, and eventually that low, rough breathing sound that told him, more clearly than any visible sign could have, that he was finally approaching the creature this entire maze had been built to contain. It is worth pausing here, in this quiet stretch of corridor, just before the confrontation itself, to imagine what must have passed through Theseus's mind in those final moments, walking steadily toward a fight he could not fully prepare for, in near total darkness, armed with nothing but a sword, his own strength, and the patient advice Ariadne had given him the night before. That courage alone would not be enough. That patience mattered just as much as strength. Whatever fear he carried into that final stretch of corridor, and it is difficult to imagine any mortal facing that moment without at least some genuine fear, he did not let it stop his steady, careful steps forward. Let's also spend a little more time with the Minotaur himself. Before we move on, because there is a quiet, uncomfortable sadness tucked inside his story that is easy to overlook amid all the fear he represented to the people of Athens and Crete alike. He was known, in the old Greek tellings, by the name Asterion, a name that meant something close to Starry One, an oddly gentle name for a creature so widely feared. He had never chosen the strange, painful circumstances of his own birth, born from a curse inflicted on his mother rather than through any fault of his own, and had spent his entire life kept hidden away in darkness, fed, in the years since the labyrinth was built specifically to contain him, only through the terrible tribute of frightened young captives, rather than through anything resembling genuine care. It is worth sitting with that sadness for just a moment, not to excuse the very real danger he posed to Theseus, and to every tribute who came before him, but to understand the fuller shape of the story a little more completely. Ariadne herself, according to some of the old tellings, felt this same complicated sorrow, having grown up in the same palace above that hidden maze, aware, in the way family members often are even of the things never openly discussed, that the creature below shared her own mother's blood, was, in some strange sense, her own half-brother, however monstrous his appearance had become. Her decision to help Theseus was never a simple, uncomplicated act of romance alone. It carried within it this same difficult tension, a young woman helping end a threat her own family had created and then hidden away, rather than ever truly resolving. This is, in many ways, one of the quiet undercurrents running through so much of Greek mythology. Monsters who were never simply born evil, but who were shaped by circumstances, curses, cruelty, or neglect that other characters in the same stories had set into motion long before the monster itself ever had any choice in the matter. It is a theme worth carrying gently into your own rest tonight too, perhaps. The reminder that very few difficult things in this world exist without some longer, more complicated history behind them. Some earlier chain of choices and consequences that shaped them long before they ever became the difficulty standing in front of you. Let's spend a little more time, too, with King Minos himself, because he is often remembered in this story only as a distant, punishing figure, demanding his terrible tribute year after year, without much thought given to the fuller shape of his own long rule. Minos was, By most ancient accounts, a genuinely significant ruler in his own right, credited by later Greek writers with establishing some of the earliest organised naval power in the entire Aegean region, using Crete's central position among the islands to build a trading network that brought considerable wealth and influence to his kingdom long before Athens itself had grown into any real prominence. His reputation for justice, oddly enough given the cruelty of the Labyrinth's tribute, was significant enough in later Greek tradition that he was said to have become, after his death, one of the judges of the dead in the underworld itself, weighing the lives of departed souls with the same careful judgment he had once applied to disputes among the living. This creates an uncomfortable, complicated portrait of the same man responsible for the terrible tribute that had haunted Athens for years. A genuinely respected ruler in most respects, whose one great cruelty grew not from any broader tyranny, but from a very particular, very personal shame surrounding his own wife's curse and the monstrous child it had produced. It is worth sitting with that complexity for a moment. The reminder that even figures remembered largely for a single cruel act rarely fit neatly into simple categories of villain or hero. Minos was, in the fuller shape of his own story, both a builder of genuine civilization and the source of genuine suffering, sometimes within the very same lifetime, sometimes, as in this case, growing out of the very same tangled family history. Perhaps there is something worth carrying gently into your own rest tonight from that thought too, that most people and most difficult situations hold more complexity inside them than any single story about them can ever fully capture. The creature was enormous, broader across the shoulders than any man Theseus had ever faced, its head unmistakably that of a bull, heavy horns curving upward in the dim light, its body otherwise human, though corded with a strength that seemed to belong to neither form entirely on its own. It turned toward him slowly, and for a brief moment, in the near total darkness of that stone chamber, the two of them simply stood facing each other, still and silent, the accumulated weight of years of fear and tribute and cruelty hanging heavy in the air between them. What followed happened quickly. The old stories tend to move past this part with a kind of respectful brevity, understanding perhaps that the details mattered less than the outcome. Theseus moved first, closing the distance before the creature could gather its full strength against him, and, in a struggle that filled that dark chamber with heavy, echoing sound, he fought with every bit of the same patient, determined strength that had carried him through 6 dangerous trials on the road to Athens, through a wrestling match with a king's own doubt, through a poisoned cup narrowly knocked from his hand. It was not an easy victory. The Minotaur was powerful and desperate in its own confused, cornered way, but Theseus, guided by the same steady patience Ariadne had urged him to hold on to, eventually found the opening he needed and ended the long, cruel tradition that had claimed so many young lives before this night. In the sudden quiet that followed, Theseus stood alone in that dark chamber, breathing hard, the maze around him utterly silent for the first time since he had entered it. There was no triumph in the moment, only a heavy, worn-out relief, the particular exhaustion that comes after a long trial, finally, completely over. He found the golden thread still trailing from his hand, and without wasting any more time in that dark chamber, began the long, careful walk back the way he had come, following the thread's quiet, patient and through every fork and turn it had already marked for him, back toward the small, distant glow of torchlight waiting at the labyrinth's entrance, the other 13 Athenian tributes, who had been separated from Theseus somewhere earlier in the maze, but never delivered to the same fate he had just faced, were gathered quickly once he emerged, and Ariadne, waiting anxiously near the entrance exactly where she had promised to be, felt an overwhelming relief wash over her at the sight of him walking calmly back out of a maze from which no one had ever returned before. There was no time to waste in celebration. Word of what had happened inside the labyrinth would reach King Knossos soon enough, and once it did, none of them, Theseus, the freed tributes, or Ariadne herself, having so openly helped a prisoner of her own father's kingdom, would be safe remaining on Crete a moment longer. Under cover of the same night, Theseus led the freed tributes and Ariadne quickly down to the harbour, to the black-sailed ship, still waiting exactly where it had first delivered them days earlier. In some of the old tellings, before they departed, they took the additional careful precaution of damaging the hulls of several other Cretan ships resting nearby in the harbour, ensuring that even if their absence was discovered quickly, no immediate pursuit could follow them out onto open water. By the time the first hints of dawn began touching the eastern sky, the ship was already well out to sea, Crete shrinking slowly behind them, carrying home 14 young Athenians who had never expected to see their own coastline again, and one Cretan princess who had given up everything familiar to her for the sake of a promise made quietly in the dark. Let's slow down once more here too, in this quiet space just after the labyrinth, before the ship ever reaches Naxos, and rest a while longer in the particular relief of a danger finally, completely past. There is a specific kind of stillness that settles over a body, once real fear has finally released its grip. Muscles that had been tense for hours or days, without you even fully noticing, finally beginning to loosen. Breath that had been shallow and careful, finally deepening again into its normal, easy rhythm. If any part of your own day carried tension, you are only now beginning to release. Let it go the same way, gradually. In its own unhurried time, the 14 freed tributes, resting across that ship's deck as the coastline of Crete finally disappeared behind them, would have carried this same physical relief in their own bodies. The particular exhaustion that follows real danger finally truly ending. Some of the old tellings mention that several among them wept openly during those first hours of the voyage home, not from continued fear, but from the sheer release of finally allowing themselves to feel the fear they had been holding carefully in check throughout their entire ordeal, unable to let it show while the danger itself was still active and immediate. Let that same permission settle over you now too, if you need it. The reminder that whatever you have been holding carefully in check through your own difficult day, worry, tension, quiet fear, does not need to be held so carefully any longer tonight. You are safe now, resting, with nothing left demanding your careful vigilance. Let it soften, the same way it must have softened across that ship's deck. 14 young Athenians finally, fully allowing themselves to simply rest. Let's spend one more quiet moment too, with Theseus' own state of mind as he finally stepped out of that labyrinth's entrance, thread still trailing from his hand, back into torchlight and open air after everything that just happened in the dark behind him. There is a particular disorienting quality to emerging from real danger back into ordinary surroundings. The world outside looking exactly the same as it had before, torches still burning steadily along the same stone walls, while everything inside you has fundamentally changed in ways the world around you has no way of immediately recognizing. It is worth imagining for a moment how strange those first few minutes back in the open air must have felt. The same palace corridors he had walked through days earlier, as a frightened tribute now witnessed by someone who had just faced and ended the very danger that Pallas had been built to hide. Ariadne, waiting anxiously exactly where she had promised to be, would have seen this change immediately in his bearing. The particular quiet weight that settles over anyone who has just faced something they were not certain they would survive. There was no time, in the urgency of their escape, for either of them to fully process what had just happened. The labyrinth finally ended, a princess about to abandon everything familiar to her, 13 frightened tributes suddenly, unexpectedly free. All of that processing would have to wait for the quieter days still ahead, aboard a ship crossing open water, far from the palace and the maze both. Let that same patient allowance settle over you now too. If today carried anything that still needs processing, any difficult feeling that hasn't quite settled yet, there is no requirement to fully understand or resolve everything tonight. Sometimes the most useful thing available to us, exactly like it was for Theseus in those first disorienting minutes after the labyrinth, is simply to keep moving gently forward, trusting that clarity and rest will both arrive in their own good time. Let's slow down for a moment here, the way we have a few times already tonight, and let this part of the story settle a little more gently before we continue. Picture that ship now, moving steadily across calm, dark water, its black sails still raised against a sky slowly filling with early stars. 14 young Athenians resting exhausted across its deck after the longest, most frightening days of their lives, finally, unbelievably, sailing home. There is a particular kind of relief that comes after a long ordeal has finally ended, heavy-limbed, quiet, almost disbelieving. If you are feeling anything like that yourself right now, tired in a good, settled way after a long day of your own, let that feeling deepen. You do not need to hold on to anything else from this part of the story. Just let it rest here for a while. A ship moving quietly homeward under a darkening sky. If this unhurried pace is helping you settle into sleep tonight, Boring History Narrative uploads a new story, exactly like this one every week. Always slow, always gentle, always built to carry a tired mind the rest of the way into rest. A quick subscribe means you'll have a new one waiting the next time you need it. For now, let's continue, gently, following that ship a little further across the water, to an island where the story takes an unexpected and quietly sad turn. The ship's first stop after leaving Crete was the small island of Knossos, where the exhausted travellers put ashore to rest before continuing the remainder of their journey home. It was there, on that quiet island, that something happened which the old stories treat with a certain careful ambiguity, never quite settling on a single clear explanation. Theseus and the freed tributes departed from Knossos without Ariadne, leaving her behind, asleep, on the island's shore, and continued on toward Athens without her. Different old tellings offer different explanations for this sudden, painful turn. Some say Theseus had genuinely fallen out of love with her by this point, the intensity of their shared danger fading now that the danger itself had passed. Others suggest a divine hand at work, that the god Dionysus had already claimed Ariadne for himself, appearing to Theseus in a dream and warning him that she was meant for a different fate entirely, one tied to divinity rather than to a mortal hero's uncertain future. Still others suggest something closer to simple, tragic circumstance, a sudden storm, an urgent need to depart quickly, a genuine intention to return for her that never quite came to pass before other, more pressing matters intervened. Whatever the true reason, the outcome remained the same across nearly every version of this old story. Ariadne, who had given up her home, her family, and her own safety for a promise made in the dark of a labyrinth, woke alone on an unfamiliar shore, watching a ship carrying everyone she had risked everything for disappear slowly over the horizon without her. It is one of the quieter sorrows tucked into this larger story, easy to move past quickly, given everything else still ahead of us tonight, but worth sitting with for just a moment before we continue. Ariadne's story does not end entirely in tragedy. In most of the old tellings, the god Dionysus did indeed find her there on Knossos, grieving and abandoned, and took her as his own bride, eventually granting her a kind of immortality that no mortal marriage could ever have offered her. Her wedding crown, in the oldest of these stories, was later placed among the stars, becoming the very constellation Corona Borealis, that still glows faintly overhead on clear nights even now, a quiet, lasting trace of a woman who was left behind, but who was not, in the end, left forgotten. Let's return once more to Knossos too, and linger a little longer on that quiet island shore than we did earlier, because it holds one of the more beautifully rendered scenes in the entire ancient telling of this story. later captured again and again by painters across thousands of years, who found something endlessly compelling in that single image: a young woman waking alone on a beach, watching a ship disappear over the horizon without her. Ancient Greek pottery, some of it surviving even now in museums across the world, shows this exact moment rendered carefully by artists king centuries after Theseus's story first began circulating. Ariadne seated on the sand, her posture caught somewhere between grief and a strange dawning peace, as though the old artists themselves understood that her story was not simply ending in abandonment, but transforming into something else entirely. The island of Knossos itself was closely associated throughout ancient Greek religious life with the worship of Dionysus, god of wine and festivity, and a particular kind of transformative, liberating joy, which makes the old storyteller's choice of setting feel less like simple coincidence and more like a deliberate, meaningful pairing. A grieving mortal woman abandoned on the one island in the entire Aegean most closely tied to the very god who would soon transform her sorrow into something lasting. Some of the old vase paintings show the moment of their meeting directly, Dionysus arriving not in some dramatic burst of divine light, but gently, almost quietly, finding Ariadne exactly where Theseus had left her, and offering her, in place of a mortal husband's uncertain future, an entirely different kind of lasting devotion. It is a small, quiet mercy tucked into an otherwise sorrowful turn in this larger story, worth carrying with you into your own rest tonight if any part of today left you feeling similarly set aside or overlooked. Endings are not always what they first appear to be while you are standing inside them. Sometimes what feels, in the moment, like being left behind on an unfamiliar shore turns out later to be the beginning of something entirely different, something that could never have unfolded any other way. Let's rest here a while longer too before we continue in the quiet space just after that dramatic escape from Crete. There is a particular kind of exhausted stillness that follows any long ordeal. The body finally allowed to stop bracing against danger, the mind slowly, gradually beginning to trust that the immediate threat has genuinely passed. Picture the freed tributes resting across that ship's deck in the hours after their escape, some of them likely unable to sleep, despite their exhaustion, minds still turning over everything that had just happened. Others falling almost immediately into the deep, heavy sleep that only true relief can bring. If you are feeling anything like that same heavy, settling relief right now, whatever difficult thing your own day may have carried, let it soften now the same way. There is nothing left demanding your attention tonight, no labyrinth left to navigate, no danger left to outrun, just the quiet, steady rhythm of a ship moving across calm water, and the same quiet, steady rhythm available to your own breathing right now, slow and unhurried, carrying you gently toward the same deep rest those exhausted travellers were finally allowed to find. The waters between Crete and the Greek mainland were busy ones in that era, dotted with smaller islands that served as natural resting points for ships making the longer crossing, which is likely part of why Naxos in particular became such a natural stopping point for Theseus's own journey home. Ancient sailors rarely attempted the full crossing in a single continuous voyage when smaller islands offered safer, more reliable places to rest, resupply fresh water, and wait out any unfavourable weather that might otherwise have made the open crossing dangerous. It is worth remembering this practical detail alongside the more mythological weight the island came to carry in this particular story, that Naxos was, before it was ever the place where Ariadne was left behind, simply a sensible, ordinary stopping point along a well-travelled sea route, the kind of small, unremarkable island that countless other ships of that era would have rested at too, entirely unaware of the story about to unfold on one particular visit. Let's pause once more gently in this quiet stretch of tonight's story and rest a while longer before we continue. Bring your attention back to your own breathing now, wherever you are resting, and let it slow further, unhurried, easy, the same patient rhythm Theseus himself relied on through every step of that long, winding maze. There is no need to rush toward the end of this story. We have plenty of time left tonight, and your only task remains exactly what it has been from the very beginning, simply to rest, and to let these words carry you gently towards sleep whenever you're ready for them to. Let's spend a little more time, too, with the wider Cretan world Theseus found himself moving through during those tense final hours before his escape. Because Crete in this era was, by every archaeological account we now have, a genuinely remarkable place. Its harbours busier and more cosmopolitan than almost anywhere else in the ancient Mediterranean, ships arriving regularly from Egypt, from the Levant, from mainland Greece, each bringing goods and stories and news from across an enormous trading network that Crete sat comfortably at the centre of. The palace at Knossos itself, beyond the labyrinth hidden beneath it, was famous even in its own time for genuine luxury, painted frescoes covering its walls, an advanced system of plumbing and drainage that would not be matched again in much of Europe for many centuries afterward. Storerooms filled with enormous ceramic jars holding oil and wine and grain in quantities that spoke to genuine, sustained prosperity. It is worth imagining for a moment the strange contrast that must have existed within that same palace between its bright, wealthy, cosmopolitan upper levels and the dark, hidden horror of the labyrinth resting just beneath it. Two entirely different worlds occupying the very same physical space, one visible and celebrated, the other hidden and quietly feared by nearly everyone who knew of its existence. Perhaps there is something worth sitting with in that image too, the reminder that even the most impressive, celebrated places can hold difficult truths just beneath their surface. And that genuine courage sometimes means being willing to walk down into whatever difficult truth a comfortable life has been built on top of, rather than simply enjoying the comfort above it. There is a little more worth knowing too about how this same story of Theseus and the labyrinth travelled forward across the centuries after it was first told, because it became, remarkably early, one of the most consistently popular subjects in ancient Greek art, appearing on pottery recovered from sites scattered across the entire Mediterranean world, evidence of just how widely and how quickly this particular story spread beyond Athens itself. Vase painters seemed particularly drawn to two specific moments above all others: the confrontation inside the labyrinth itself, and the quieter, sadder scene of Ariadne left behind on the shore of Naxos, as though ancient audiences, much like audiences today, found themselves drawn equally to moments of dramatic triumph and moments of quiet human sorrow. Roman writers and artists, centuries later, continued this same fascination, adapting the story into their own literature and their own decorative traditions, mosaics depicting the labyrinth's winding pattern, becoming a genuinely popular decorative motif across the Roman world. Found in wealthy villas from Britain to North Africa, the maze pattern itself eventually becoming a kind of visual shorthand recognized across an enormous stretch of the ancient world, long after most people encountering it had any detailed memory of the specific mythological story it had originally represented. It is a strange kind of endurance for a story to have, surviving not only through direct retelling, generation after generation, but through visual patterns and decorative traditions that outlasted, in many cases, any clear memory of their original meaning. Perhaps that is worth carrying gently into your own rest tonight too. The reminder that meaningful things sometimes continue quietly shaping the world around us, long after the specific reasons for their meaning have faded from conscious memory. Patterns and habits and quiet influences passed down through generations without anyone fully remembering anymore exactly where they first began. Let's spend one last quiet moment too with the golden thread itself before it disappears fully from this story, because it has, in the centuries since, become one of the most enduring symbols to grow out of this entire mythology, referenced today in fields as far removed from ancient Greece as mathematics and computer science, where the phrase Ariadne's thread is still sometimes used to describe any simple, reliable method for solving an otherwise overwhelming problem by breaking it down into small, trackable steps. It is a remarkable kind of endurance for a single small object, a ball of thread given quietly in the dark by a frightened, hopeful young woman, to still carry meaning for people thousands of years later, who may never have heard the full story it originally belonged to. There is something worth sitting with in that endurance for a moment now, as tonight's story draws toward its final rest. The smallest, quietest gestures, a piece of thread, a whispered piece of advice, a promise kept in the dark, are so often what actually carries someone safely through their hardest trials, far more than any grand display of strength ever could. Whatever small, quiet support has carried you through your own difficult days recently. However unglamorous or easily overlooked it might seem next to more dramatic solutions, it deserves exactly this same quiet gratitude. The same lasting recognition that a simple ball of golden thread still receives, thousands of years after it first unwound through a dark and winding maze. Let that thought rest alongside you now, gently, as we prepare to leave this story's remaining chapters behind and settle fully into rest. There is nothing else this small detail needs to teach you tonight, only this quiet reminder that small things, held onto carefully, can carry us through remarkably large difficulties. The ship continued on from Knossos, carrying Theseus and the freed tributes the remaining distance across open water toward home, the mood aboard a strange, heavy mixture of relief and grief in equal measure. Theseus, whatever his true reasons for leaving Ariadne behind, carried the weight of that decision with him for the remainder of the voyage, distracted, in the old tellings, by grief and complicated emotion in a way that would soon prove tragically important. Somewhere in the middle of that long, quiet stretch of sailing, lost in his own thoughts, he forgot entirely about the promise he had made to his father before ever departing Athens, the promise to raise white sails on the journey home if he survived, so that Aegeus, watching anxiously from the cliffs above the city, would know the outcome long before the ship ever reached the harbour. It is worth pausing here for a moment to imagine what those weeks must have felt like for Aegeus himself, waiting alone in Athens the entire time his son was away, climbing, it is said, to a high cliff overlooking the sea nearly every day, watching the horizon for any sign of a returning ship, carrying inside him both hope and a much older, quieter dread, the same dread that had shadowed him since that strange riddle from the oracle, so many years earlier, the warning never to loosen his wineskin until he was safely home. A warning he had never fully understood, but had never quite been able to shake either. As the ship carrying Theseus finally approached the coastline of Attica, its black sails still raised, unchanged, the exhausted young hero rested below deck, the difficult voyage nearly over, home finally within reach. He did not see, as the ship rounded the final stretch of coastline toward Athens' harbour, his own father standing at the edge of that same cliff he had climbed so many times before, watching, with the particular held breath of a parent who has waited far too long for news, as a ship finally came into view on the horizon, its sails still unmistakably black. We will follow what happened next, on that cliff above Athens in the final part of tonight's story. For now, let the ship rest quietly on the water a while longer, still moving steadily toward a harbour it has not quite reached yet, still carrying aboard it a young man resting below deck, unaware of the weight still waiting for him on shore. Let your own breathing slow further here too, unhurried, easy, in and out, the same steady rhythm as a ship moving quietly across a calm evening sea. Before we return to that cliff above Athens, let's slow down once more and spend a few quiet minutes with the real history, quietly tucked beneath this ancient myth, because the story of the Labyrinth and the Minotaur like so many old Greek legends, seems to rest on top of something genuinely real, buried for thousands of years before anyone ever uncovered it again. In the early 20th century, an archaeologist named Arthur Evans began excavating the site of Knossos on the island of Crete, and what he found there was extraordinary. The enormous, sprawling ruins of an actual Bronze Age palace, so vast and complex in its layout, room after connected room, corridor after winding corridor, that early visitors walking through its excavated ruins reportedly described the experience of getting lost inside it almost immediately. An eerie, real-world echo of the mythical maze that had supposedly stood in that exact same location thousands of years earlier. Evans uncovered evidence of an entire lost civilization archaeologists now call the Minoans, named after King Minos himself, a sophisticated Bronze Age culture that had once dominated trade and influence across the Aegean Sea, with Crete as its beating heart. Among the palace's excavated walls, faded but still visible frescoes were discovered, depicting young men and women leaping gracefully over the backs of charging bulls. A genuine and apparently celebrated Minoan sport or ritual, one that some historians believe may have eventually blurred, across centuries of retelling and half-remembered oral history, into the darker, more monstrous legend of Athenian youths delivered into a labyrinth to face a bull-headed creature. The real history, in other words, was likely never quite as literal as the myth eventually became, but the deep, layered connection between an actual lost palace, an actual bull-centered culture, and a story that survived for thousands of years afterward is one of the genuinely remarkable things this particular legend offers. Myth and buried history resting quietly on top of each other, waiting patiently for someone to finally dig down far enough to find where one became the other. Let that thought settle over you gently now. An entire lost civilization, an entire vanished world of palace corridors and bull-leaping ceremonies, sleeping quietly beneath the earth for thousands of years before anyone remembered it was there at all. There is something worth borrowing from that image for your own rest tonight, the idea that even things fully forgotten do not disappear entirely, that they simply wait, patient and undisturbed, until it is finally time for them to be uncovered again. Whatever you are carrying into sleep tonight can rest just as quietly, set aside for now, waiting patiently until you are ready to return to it, if you ever need to at all. If tonight's slower pace and quieter historical detours are helping your own mind settle, remember that boring history narrative builds every story exactly this way, unhurried, layered, more interested in easing you toward rest than in rushing through events. A subscription costs nothing and ensures a new story like this one is always waiting for you. For now, let's return, gently, to that cliff above Athens, where a father is still watching the horizon. Welcome back, one final time tonight, to Boring History Narrative, for the third and closing part of Theseus's long story. We left him resting below deck on a ship approaching the coastline of Attica, its sails still black, unchanged from the morning colour it had carried since departing Athens weeks earlier, while his father Aegeus stood watching from a high cliff above the city, waiting anxiously for any sign of his son's fate. Aegeus saw the ship first as a small dark shape on the horizon, and felt in that first distant glimpse a flicker of hope rise in his chest. A ship finally, after so many long weeks of anxious waiting. But as the vessel drew closer, and its sails became clearer against the pale morning sky, that hope collapsed into something far heavier. The sails were black, exactly the colour they had been when the ship first departed, carrying his son and 13 other young Athenians toward almost certain death. Aegeus, watching from that cliff, could see no other explanation for what those unchanged black sails must mean. His son, he believed, had not survived the labyrinth after all. The old stories describe what happened next with a heavy, simple sorrow. Aegeus, overwhelmed by grief he had feared for weeks and now believed fully confirmed, threw himself from the cliff into the sea below, ending his life in the very waters his son's ship was, at that exact moment, still sailing safely across, alive and whole, simply forgetful of a single small promise made weeks earlier in the middle of everything else that had happened since. It is a devastating irony sitting at the heart of this part of the story, a father's death caused entirely by a small oversight rather than any true tragedy, grief born from a colour of sailcloth rather than from any real loss at all. That same sea from that day forward was given a new name in Aegeus's memory, the Aegean Sea, the very body of water that still carries his name on every map drawn since. Theseus arrived in Athens' harbour not long after, expecting a joyful reunion with the father he had left behind, only to be met instead with the devastating news of what had happened on that cliff while he slept unaware below deck. The old stories rarely dwell long on his immediate grief, but it is not difficult to imagine the particular, unbearable weight of it, surviving an impossible trial only to return home and learn that his own forgetfulness, in the middle of everything else he had been carrying, had cost his father's life. Whatever grief he carried, though, Athens itself could not simply pause to accommodate it. A city needed a ruler, and Theseus, the returning hero who had ended years of terrible tribute to Crete, was the only clear choice remaining to take his father's place. Theseus became king of Athens, carrying both the grief of his father's death and the quiet, complicated guilt of knowing how easily it could have been prevented. Rather than allowing that grief to define his early reign, he turned his attention toward a larger, lasting project, one that would shape Athens for centuries beyond his own lifetime. At the time he took the throne, the region surrounding Athens, known as Attica, was still divided into numerous small, independent towns and villages, each governing itself separately, each with its own local loyalties and occasional rivalries, with Athens serving as only one settlement among several, rather than a true unifying capital. Theseus is credited, in both myth and in the genuine historical memory of ancient Athenians themselves, with bringing about a great unification of these scattered communities, known to later Greek historians as the Synoikismos, persuading, or in some tellings, gently compelling the surrounding towns to accept Athens as their shared political centre, while still allowing each community to maintain its own local identity and traditions. It was a slow, patient kind of achievement, built not through any single dramatic battle or trial, but through years of careful diplomacy and persuasion, the same steady patience that had carried him through a dangerous coastal road and a winding dark labyrinth now turned toward the quieter, less glamorous work of building a lasting government. Ancient Athenians themselves, centuries later, continued to celebrate this unification with an annual festival, a small, lasting thread connecting a mythical hero's reign to the genuine civic identity of one of history's most influential cities. Theseus is remembered, across many of the old tellings, as a notably fair and thoughtful ruler in these settled years, said to have voluntarily given up some of his own personal authority to establish early forms of shared governance among Athens' citizens, a democratic impulse that later Athenian writers, living centuries afterward under their own famous democracy, took particular pride in tracing back to their legendary founding king. Whether or not every detail of this civic legacy reflects genuine historical fact, it reveals something meaningful about how the Athenians themselves chose to remember him, not merely as a monster-slaying hero, but as a builder, a unifier, someone who turned personal strength and courage toward the quieter, harder work of building something lasting for others, but peace and settled governance. As this entire story has already shown more than once tonight, rarely lasted long undisturbed in these old tellings, and Theseus's later years would carry him back into adventure, friendship, and eventually into far darker territory than any labyrinth had ever held. Let's slow down and spend a little more time with Theseus's years as king, because this quieter, more governing chapter of his life carries a different kind of significance than the dramatic trials that came before it, one that genuinely shaped how later Athenians understood their own city's identity. The unification of Attica under Athens was not simply a political maneuver in the old tellings. It was remembered as the very moment Athens transformed from one settlement among several into something resembling a true nation. Small towns that had once managed their own local affairs, settled their own local disputes, and occasionally warred with their neighbours over grazing rights or water access, all gradually accepting a shared civic identity centred on Athens itself. Ancient historians writing centuries later, including the biographer Plutarch, whose account of Theseus's life remains one of the most detailed sources we still have today, described this unification as something achieved largely through persuasion rather than conquest. Theseus travelling personally between these smaller communities, meeting with local leaders, offering assurances that their own traditions and local governance would remain respected even as they joined a larger political structure. It was, in its own quiet way, just as demanding a trial as anything he had faced on the road to Athens or inside the Labyrinth itself, requiring not physical strength but sustained patience, diplomatic care, and a genuine willingness to listen to concerns very different from his own. Plutarch also credits Theseus with establishing an early distinction between different classes of Athenian citizens, nobles, farmers, and craftsmen, each granted particular roles and responsibilities within the city's governance, a structure that later Athenian democracy would eventually build upon and transform across subsequent centuries. Whether every detail of this civic legacy reflects genuine historical fact or represents later Athenians projecting their own democratic pride backward onto a legendary founding figure, the fact that they chose to build this particular story around him at all reveals something meaningful about which qualities they valued most in their own collective memory. Not simply strength or courage alone, but the patient, careful work of building lasting institutions that could outlast any single ruler's lifetime. Let's rest here a while longer too, in this quiet stretch of Theseus's later years as king, before we continue toward the more difficult chapters still ahead. Picture Athens during these settled years, the city gradually growing busier and more prosperous under his careful governance, new families arriving from the smaller unified towns to settle within its walls, markets growing steadily more crowded, the particular quiet satisfaction of a ruler watching a project years in the making, finally, gradually, take lasting shape around him. It is worth imagining Theseus himself during these years, no longer the restless young man who had once sought out danger deliberately on the road from Troezen, but someone settling, gradually, into the quieter, more patient work of simply tending carefully to something he had already built. There is a particular kind of contentment available in exactly this stretch of any long life, the settled satisfaction that comes after the most dramatic trials have passed, when the work remaining is steady and worthwhile, rather than urgent or dangerous. If your own life has ever included a season like that, difficult work finally behind you, replaced by the quieter, steadier work of simply maintaining and tending to what you built, let that same settled contentment rest alongside you now too, wherever you happen to be resting tonight. If this unhurried pace continues easing you towards sleep, remember that boring history narrative always builds its stories exactly this way, patient, layered, unhurried. A subscription costs nothing and ensures a new story like this one is always waiting for you the next time you need it. For now, let's continue gently into the friendship that would eventually carry Theseus back into far more dangerous territory than any settled kingdom could offer. Let's pause here for a while, the way we have throughout tonight's story, and let your body settle a little further into rest. Bring your attention gently to your breath, and let it slow, the same unhurried rhythm as a city slowly. patiently uniting itself over years rather than rushing toward change all at once. There is no urgency required in your own rest tonight either. Let your shoulders soften. Let your hands rest loosely, holding nothing. Whatever weight your own day carried can be set down now, the same way Theseus eventually set down the grief of his father's death by turning his attention towards something patient and lasting instead. If this slow, layered kind of storytelling is easing you towards sleep tonight, boring history narrative has a new story like this one, waiting every week, always built the same unhurried way. A subscription costs nothing, and means you'll never need to search for a story like this one again. Now, let's continue gently into the later years of Theseus's long, complicated life. In these later years, Theseus formed one of the most notable friendships of the entire ancient mythological world, with a fellow adventurer named Pirithous, king of a people called the Labyrinths. Their friendship began, unusually enough, with a near battle rather than a peaceful meeting. Pirithous having heard of Theseus's growing reputation and deciding to test it by raiding some of his cattle, only for the two men, once they finally stood face to face prepared to fight, to find themselves instead struck by mutual respect and admiration, ending their confrontation not in violence but in a lifelong bond of loyalty instead. Together, the two friends shared numerous later adventures, including standing alongside Theseus at Pirithous' own wedding, a celebration that turned to sudden chaos when a group of drunken centaur guests attempted to abduct the bride and other women present. A chaotic battle the old stories remember as the War of the Centaurs and Labyrinths, which Theseus and Pirithous fought through together side by side. It was this same deep friendship, though, that eventually led both men into far more dangerous and morally complicated territory. Having each lost a wife by this point in their lives, the two friends made a reckless, prideful pact together that each would help the other win a bride worthy of the sons of gods, however difficult or dangerous that pursuit might prove to be. Theseus's choice, made in this same reckless spirit, was Helen, the same Helen whose later abduction by a Trojan prince would eventually spark the entire Trojan War, though at this point in the timeline she was still only a young girl, and Theseus's decision to take her, even briefly, sits uncomfortably alongside the more admirable parts of his legacy, a genuine moral shadow that the old storytellers themselves did not entirely shy away from acknowledging. Helen was eventually recovered safely by her own brothers before any lasting harm came to her, but Pirithous' own reckless ambition proved far more costly for them both. Having helped Theseus with his pursuit, Pirithous now called in the return favour, an ambition so audacious it bordered on genuine madness, that Theseus helped him descend into the underworld itself to abduct Persephone, queen of the dead, as Pirithous' own bride. Theseus, bound by the same fierce loyalty that had defined their entire friendship, agreed to accompany him, and the two descended together into the shadowed realm ruled by Hades, a realm no living mortal was ever meant to disturb in such a way. Let's spend a little more time, too, with Pirithous himself before we follow the two friends down into the underworld, because their bond deserves a slower telling than we gave it earlier. The Labyrinths, the people Pirithous ruled over, lived in the region of Thessaly, in northern Greece, a land of wide plains and rugged mountains quite different from the coastal cities Theseus had spent most of his own life in. Pirithous was remembered, across the old tellings, as bold to the point of recklessness, a ruler who approached every challenge with an eagerness that occasionally outran his own better judgment, which perhaps explains why testing Theseus's reputation through a cattle raid seemed, to him, like a perfectly reasonable way to introduce himself. Their friendship, once it began, seemed to balance something important in each of them, Theseus's own steady patience tempering Pirithous' boldness. Pirithous' fearless enthusiasm drawing Theseus back toward the kind of adventure his years of careful governance had gradually pushed further into his past. It is the particular gift certain friendships offer, each person drawing something out of the other that neither would have easily found alone, and it makes the eventual tragedy of their final adventure together feel even heavier. A friendship built on genuine complementary balance, undone in the end by exactly the reckless boldness that had first drawn Theseus to him. It is worth sitting with that complexity for a moment. The way even our most valuable friendships can carry within them the same qualities that eventually lead us into difficulty. Boldness that inspires us, also capable of leading us somewhere genuinely dangerous. Loyalty that strengthens us, also capable of asking more of us than we should reasonably give. Theseus's decision to follow Pirithous into the underworld was, in its own way, simply loyalty carried to its furthest possible extreme. The same loyalty that had once stood beside his friend through a chaotic wedding battle, now leading him somewhere far darker and far more permanent than either of them could have anticipated. Let's also spend a little longer with the wedding battle between the Lapiths and Centaurs, because it became, in later Greek art and storytelling, one of the most frequently depicted scenes from Theseus's entire life, carved into temple friezes and painted onto countless surviving vases, a visual shorthand ancient Greeks often used to represent the broader struggle between civilization and untamed chaos. The wedding itself had begun peacefully enough, a celebration among friends and allies, centaurs included among the invited guests, as a gesture of goodwill between neighbouring peoples who did not always coexist easily. But wine, as it so often does in these old stories, loosened restraint far more than anyone intended, and the celebration collapsed suddenly into violence when several centaur guests, overcome by drink, attempted to carry off the bride and other women present at the feast. Theseus, fighting alongside his friend Pirithous and the other Lapith guests, found himself at the centre of a chaotic battle that spilled out from the wedding hall itself into the surrounding courtyards. Furniture and wine vessels transformed suddenly into makeshift weapons, the celebration's earlier warmth replaced entirely by desperate, close combat. It was, by every old account, a frightening and disorienting fight, made more dangerous by the setting itself, a space built for celebration, rather than defence, crowded with guests who had gathered expecting nothing more dangerous than an evening of feasting and dancing. The battle eventually ended in victory for the Lapiths and their allies, the centaurs driven back and scattered. But the events of that single chaotic evening left a lasting mark on how later Greeks understood the fragile boundary between order and disorder, civilization and its opposite, a boundary that could apparently collapse with startling speed even at something as ordinary and joyful as a wedding celebration among friends. It is a sobering thought to sit with for a moment, how quickly warmth and celebration can turn, under the wrong pressures, into chaos, and how much steady courage it can take, in that sudden turn, to protect the people around you, rather than simply protecting yourself. Hades, ruler of that shadowed realm, understanding immediately the audacity of what these two mortal men had come to attempt, did not confront them with open anger or violence. Instead, he offered them a seat, inviting them, with a kind of quiet, dangerous courtesy, to rest a while in his own hall, before continuing any further with their plans. The two friends accepted, and sat down together on what appeared to be an ordinary stone bench, only to discover, the moment they tried to rise again, that they could not. The stone had bound itself to them, holding them fast in what the old stories called the chair of forgetfulness, a punishment far crueler in its quiet stillness than any dramatic battle might have been, trapping them there, unable to move, unable to leave, slowly forgetting, the longer they sat, even who they were and why they had come. Theseus and Pirithous remained trapped in that underworld hall for what the old stories describe as a very long time, held fast by stone, their memories slowly dimming, their strength slowly fading, a strange, sorrowful mirror of the Labyrinth Theseus, had once escaped so cleverly years earlier, except this time, no golden thread could help him find his way back out. It was, in the end, not his own cleverness or strength that finally freed him, but the arrival of Hercules, who happened to be passing through the underworld during his own 12th labour, the one that carried him down to capture Cerberus at the very gates of the dead. Hercules, recognising Theseus trapped there, took pity on his fellow hero, and using his own tremendous strength, managed to tear Theseus free from the binding stone. Though the old stories note, in one of the story's quieter, sadder details, that a portion of Theseus's own flesh was said to remain fused to the stone in the effort, a small physical price paid for freedom after so long trapped in that forgetful dark. Pirithous, whose own ambition had led them both into this danger in the first place, was not so fortunate. The earth itself was said to shake violently when Hercules attempted to free him as well, a sign, the old stories suggest, that some transgressions were simply too great even for a hero of Hercules' strength to undo, and Pirithous remained behind, trapped forever in the underworld he had so recklessly tried to steal a bride from. Theseus returned to the world above deeply changed by that long imprisonment, having lost his closest friend, and having spent an unknown stretch of time trapped somewhere between memory and forgetting, between the living world and the realm of the dead. It is worth sitting with that image for a moment now, in your own quiet room tonight. The particular strange mercy of finally being freed from something that held you still for far too long, memory slowly returning, strength slowly returning, the world above finally, gradually, coming back into focus after so long spent in patient, forgetful darkness. Let's spend a little more time, too, with the underworld itself, before we continue toward the final chapters of this story, because the realm Theseus and Pirithous ventured into carried its own carefully imagined geography in the old Greek tradition, a place the ancient mind understood in remarkably specific, layered detail, rather than simply as a vague and shapeless darkness. Souls arriving in that realm, the old stories say, first crossed the river Styx, ferried by the boatman Charon, who required a small coin as payment for the crossing, a tradition so widely believed across the ancient Greek world that it became genuine burial practice. Families placing a small coin in the mouth or hand of their dead to ensure safe passage into whatever waited beyond. Beyond that crossing lay the realm ruled jointly by Hades and Persephone, itself divided into different regions depending on how a soul had lived. The peaceful, flowering fields of Elysium reserved for the virtuous and the heroic, the shadowy, indistinct fields of Asphodel, where most ordinary souls were said to wander in quiet, dreamlike stillness and darker regions still, reserved for those who had committed genuine wrongs against the gods or against their fellow mortals during their mortal lives. It was into this same carefully imagined realm, populated by ferrymen and judges and endless fields of drifting souls, that Theseus and Pirithous ventured, alive, seeking something no living mortal had any right to request, the abduction of the realm's own queen. It is worth imagining for a moment what that descent must have felt like. Walking consciously and deliberately into a realm every living person eventually enters only once unwillingly, at the very end of their own story, surrounded the entire way by countless quiet shades of the already dead, drifting past in that same dim, directionless stillness the old stories describe so consistently across so many centuries of retelling. Whatever courage or foolishness drove Pirithous' original plan, walking that path himself alongside his friend, even Theseus, veteran by this point of a labyrinth and 6 dangerous bandits in a wrestling match no one had ever survived, must have felt something entirely new stirring in him. Standing in the presence of death itself, rather than merely facing danger that could, eventually, be outrun or overcome, Theseus returned to Athens only to find a city greatly changed during his long absence. Its people uncertain of his fate, new leadership having taken root in his place. and a growing sense, among many of his own citizens, that too much time had passed and too much uncertainty had settled in for him to simply resume his old authority as though nothing had happened. Rather than fighting to reclaim a throne that no longer welcomed him easily, Theseus made a quiet, difficult choice in these final years of his life, formally cursing the city he had once unified and ruled so carefully, and departing from Athens entirely, seeking a smaller, quieter refuge elsewhere. He travelled eventually to the island of Skyros, where an old family connection offered him the promise of land and welcome from its ruler, King Lycomedes. But Lycomedes, whether out of fear that this famous, still powerful hero might eventually threaten his own rule, or for reasons the old stories never fully clarify, betrayed that promised hospitality. He led Theseus up to a high cliff on the island, offering to show him the full extent of the land being granted to him. And there, in a moment the old tellings describe with a quiet, unceremonious sadness, pushed him from the cliff's edge into the sea below, ending, in a single sudden act of betrayal, the long eventful life of a man who had once wrestled bandits, faced a monster in total darkness, unified a kingdom, and been freed from the underworld itself by a friend's tremendous strength. It is a strange, understated ending for someone whose earlier trials had carried so much drama and danger within them. No final grand battle, no last heroic stand, simply a quiet betrayal on an unfamiliar cliff, far from the city he had once built and ruled so carefully. Perhaps that quiet, undramatic ending is itself worth sitting with for a moment. A reminder that even the most eventful lives, filled with monsters and labyrinths and underworld imprisonment, still eventually end the same simple mortal way every life does, in stillness, without fanfare. The story simply, quietly closing. Athens, though, did not forget him, whatever complicated feelings had led to his final exile. Centuries later, his memory was formally honoured by the city he had once unified. His bones, according to ancient historical accounts rather than myth alone, said to have been recovered from Skyros and ceremonially returned to Athens, where a great shrine was built in his memory, a place of refuge afterward for the powerless and the wronged, a fitting final legacy for a hero whose entire story had so often been about protecting those who could not protect themselves, from bandits on a dangerous road, from a labyrinth's endless dark, from a tribute that had once claimed the lives of Athens' own children, before he finally permanently ended it. Let's spend a little more time too, with the shrine later built in Theseus' honour back in Athens, because its later use reveals something meaningful about how the city ultimately chose to remember him. The Theseon, as it came to be known, was established, according to ancient accounts, as a place of asylum, somewhere that slaves and those who had been wronged or mistreated could seek refuge and formal protection under law. A genuinely significant institution, in a world where such protections were rarely guaranteed to society's most vulnerable members. It is a fitting final legacy, considering the shape of his entire life. A hero who had once cleared a dangerous road of bandits preying on ordinary travellers, who had once ended a terrible tribute that had cost Athens its own children for years, now honoured permanently through a place specifically dedicated to protecting people who had nowhere else to turn for safety. Ancient sources suggest this shrine remained an active, meaningful institution for centuries after it was first established. Ordinary Athenians continuing to seek its protection, long after the specific historical circumstances of Theseus' own life had faded into distant legend. There is something worth carrying gently into your own rest tonight from this final detail too. The idea that the most lasting legacies are not always the most dramatic ones. A labyrinth defeated, a monster ended. These make for exciting telling, but it was this quieter legacy, a shrine offering ongoing protection to people in genuine need, that Athens chose to maintain actively for centuries, long after the more dramatic chapters of his story had settled fully into legend. Perhaps the truest measure of any life, in the end, is not the trials it survived, but the lasting shelter it managed to offer others once those trials were finally behind it. There is one more piece of this story worth adding before we return to that final cliff on Skyros. A strange and thoughtful puzzle that grew out of Theseus's own legacy centuries after his death, one that philosophers were still debating long after ancient Athens itself had faded into history, and that people still discuss today in classrooms and conversations far removed from anything to do with mythology at all. The ship Theseus had sailed home from Crete, the very same vessel that had once carried 14 frightened tributes across the sea and back again, was preserved afterward by the Athenians as a treasured monument, kept seaworthy for centuries through careful, ongoing maintenance, sailed on ceremonial voyages long after the man who had once commanded it was gone. But maintaining a wooden ship for centuries meant replacing its planks one at a time as they gradually rotted or weakened. A plank here, a beam there, repaired and replaced steadily across so many generations that eventually philosophers debating the matter later realized every single original piece of timber had at some point been swapped out for new material. This raised a genuinely difficult question that thinkers continued wrestling with for centuries afterward, one that still carries the name the Ship of Theseus in philosophical discussions held today. All these thousands of years later, if every original plank has eventually been replaced, is it still, truly, the same ship that once carried Theseus home from Crete? Or does gradual, complete replacement create something new entirely, wearing only the same name and the same familiar shape as the vessel it slowly, plank by plank, became? It's a strange, quiet kind of immortality for a story to carry forward, not through repeated retelling of dramatic battles alone, but through a genuinely difficult question about identity and change that still occupies serious thinkers today. Perhaps there is something worth borrowing from that old puzzle for your own rest tonight too, the reminder that identity itself, whether a ship's or a person's, is rarely a single fixed thing, but something continuously rebuilt, piece by piece, day by day, remaining recognizably itself even as nearly everything within it slowly changes and renews. There is one more piece worth adding too, about how later Greek philosophers and historians approached Theseus's story, because it reveals something interesting about how the ancient mind itself understood the boundary between myth and genuine history. The historian Plutarch, whose detailed account of Theseus's life remains one of our most valuable sources today, approached the old legends with a notably careful, questioning eye, deliberately setting aside the most fantastical elements. A monster half man and half bull, a labyrinth no mortal mind could navigate unaided, in favour of trying to understand what more plausible, more human events might have originally given rise to such extraordinary stories. Plutarch suggested, for instance, that the Minotaur might have originally been a real, if fearsome, military commander named Taurus, whose name simply meant bull in the ancient tongue, and that the yearly tribute of young Athenians might have originally involved something closer to a genuine military captivity, or a dangerous athletic competition, rather than any literal monster at the centre of an actual maze. Whether or not any of these more grounded explanations reflect genuine historical fact, they reveal something meaningful about how even ancient audiences, centuries closer to these events than we are today, still approached their own oldest legends with a thoughtful mixture of reverence and careful, questioning curiosity, unwilling to simply accept every fantastical detail at face value, even while still honouring the deeper truth and meaning the story continued to carry for their own culture. It is worth sitting with that same careful, thoughtful curiosity for a moment now too, as tonight's long story finally draws toward its close. Whether every detail we've walked through tonight reflects literal historical fact or centuries of gradual myth-making, layered over some far simpler, more human original event, the deeper truths this story carries patient courage, complicated loyalty, the quiet, lasting work of building something worth leaving behind, remain genuinely worth carrying with you, regardless of exactly how literally any single detail actually happened. There is one final small detail worth adding too, before this long story finally settles into its closing rest. Something about the particular way Theseus's story continued to be reshaped across the centuries by writers and artists who each found something slightly different worth emphasizing within it. Medieval writers, encountering these old Greek legends centuries later through Roman intermediaries, sometimes reframed Theseus less as a mythological hero and more as an early example of a wise and just ruler, a model for their own kings to study and imitate, stripping away much of the Labyrinth's mythological strangeness to focus instead on the patient, careful governance of his later years. Renaissance artists, rediscovering classical mythology with fresh enthusiasm centuries after that, returned emphasis instead to the dramatic, visual moments, the labyrinth, the golden thread, Ariadne's sorrow on the shore, filling galleries across Europe with paintings capturing exactly those scenes. Each generation, in other words, found something slightly different worth carrying forward from this same long story, proof that a truly enduring legend is rarely a single fixed thing, but something continuously reshaped by whoever happens to be telling it, each new teller finding within it whatever meaning their own particular moment happens to need most. Tonight, in your own particular moment, perhaps what this story has offered you most is simply its slow, unhurried pace, its patient walk through an entire long life, its gentle permission to let your own tired mind finally rest. Let's return, gently now, to that final cliff on Skyrose and spend a slower, quieter moment with the ending of this long story than we did the first time through. Skyrose was a smaller, more remote island than Athens itself, known for rugged, rocky terrain that made much of it difficult to farm, its people depending more heavily on fishing and trade than the richer agricultural regions surrounding Athens. It is easy to imagine Theseus, arriving there after years of adventure and loss, friends left behind in the underworld, a city no longer entirely certain it wanted him back, finding something almost appealing in the idea of a smaller, quieter refuge, far removed from the political complexity that had come to define his later years. King Lycomedes welcomed him initially with every appearance of genuine hospitality, and it is worth remembering, sitting with this final betrayal, that Theseus had by this point in his long life survived bandits, wrestlers, a labyrinth, an underworld's binding stone, and years of careful political governance, and had likely grown accustomed to trusting his own judgment about the dangers and safety of any situation he found himself in. Whatever quiet unease he may or may not have felt walking up that final cliff path beside a king, he had every reason to trust. The old stories suggest it was not enough to make him hesitate, or to make him suspect that the true danger waiting for him that day would come not from any monster or bandit, but from the quiet, ordinary betrayal of a man who simply wanted him gone. The moment itself, when it finally came, happened quickly. The old tellings suggest a sudden push rather than any prolonged confrontation, the particular cruelty of an ending that offered no chance to fight back, no final struggle to at least meet on his own terms. It stands in such stark contrast to nearly every other trial across his entire life, each of which he faced directly, with at least some opportunity to use his strength or his cleverness in his own defense. This ending offered him neither. Perhaps that is part of why, centuries later, Athens felt compelled to recover his remains and build a shrine in his honor, a way of giving him, after death, the dignity and honor that his final, sudden moment of life had been denied. Let's spend one final quiet moment too, considering the whole shape of Theseus's life together, now that we have walked through nearly all of it tonight. Because there is a pattern worth noticing that runs through every chapter we have covered, from that first heavy boulder on a quiet beach all the way to a final cliff on a remote island, again and again, across an entire long life. Theseus faced difficulty, not through simple brute force alone, but through patience, careful observation, and a willingness to accept help when it was genuinely offered. A father's hidden sword, an old woman's roadside warning, Ariadne's golden thread, even, in the end, Hercules' own tremendous strength freeing him from stone that his own strength alone could never have broken. This same pattern, strength paired always with patience, courage paired always with a willingness to accept help, offers something genuinely worth carrying forward from this long story tonight. Long after its final details have blurred and softened towards sleep, none of us face our own difficult roads entirely alone, however much it might sometimes feel that way in the middle of a hard day or a hard season. There is usually some quiet thread available to us too, if we are patient enough to notice it and humble enough to accept it, some small piece of guidance or help that makes an otherwise impossible task suddenly, quietly, possible. Let that thought settle over you now, gently, as this long story finally, completely draws toward its close. Whatever labyrinth your own recent days have carried, know that you do not have to navigate it through strength alone. Rest here now, in this final quiet stretch of tonight's journey, and let whatever thread has carried you this far continue carrying you the rest of the way toward the sleep you have been walking toward this entire time. There is one final piece of this story worth adding before we let it close completely tonight. Something about how Theseus' own legacy continued growing for centuries after his death, long past the shrine built to honour his recovered remains. Ancient Athenians came to see him as something close to a second founder of their city, a figure whose story sat alongside their actual historical achievements as a kind of shared cultural foundation, invoked in public speeches, painted onto pottery traded across the entire Mediterranean world, carved into temple decorations that ordinary citizens walked past every single day without necessarily thinking too deeply about the details. The same way a familiar old story eventually becomes part of the background texture of an entire culture's sense of itself. When Athenian soldiers faced the invading Persian army centuries later, at the famous Battle of Marathon, some ancient accounts describe soldiers claiming to have seen Theseus himself, risen from his shrine, fighting alongside them in their own moment of desperate need, a story that reveals, more than any simple historical fact could, just how deeply this legendary king had become woven into how Athenians understood their own courage and their own identity as a people. Whether or not any soldier truly believed they saw him that day, the fact that the story took hold and spread says everything about what Theseus had come to represent by that point. Not simply an ancient king from a half-remembered legend, but a living symbol of the same patient courage that had once cleared a dangerous road, entered a dark labyrinth, and eventually unified a scattered collection of small towns into something lasting. That is, perhaps, the truest legacy of this entire long story. Not the lion pelt or the golden thread or any single dramatic trial, but the way an entire city, for centuries afterward, continued finding in his old story exactly the kind of courage and patience they needed for their own moments of difficulty. Whatever you are carrying into your own rest tonight, know that stories like this one have been quietly helping tired people find their own steadiness for thousands of years now, long before tonight, and long after it too. Let's slow all the way down now for these final few minutes of tonight's long layered story. Somewhere above wherever you're resting right now, whether you can see it tonight or not, a faint constellation still turns slowly through the dark sky, Corona Borealis, the northern crown, placed there, the old stories say, in memory of Ariadne, left behind on a quiet shore, but never entirely forgotten. It is a fitting last image to carry with you tonight, a reminder that even the parts of this story that ended in sadness, a father's grief-driven fall from a cliff, a princess abandoned on an island shore, A friend left behind forever in the underworld's quiet dark, still left something lasting behind them, a name given to an entire sea, a crown of stars still glowing softly overhead. A shrine built centuries later for a hero who spent his whole life trying, however imperfectly, to protect people who could not protect themselves. Think back, if you'd like, one final time tonight, to that torchlit doorway where this story first began. A young man standing at the edge of an ancient maze, a small ball of golden thread in one hand, everything still uncertain ahead of him. He could not have known, standing there in that flickering torchlight, everything that still waited for him afterward, a princess's help and her own quiet heartbreak, a father's tragic misunderstanding, a kingdom patiently unified, a friend lost forever to the underworld's cold stone, and finally a quiet, unceremonious ending on a cliff far from everything he had built. None of us, standing at the edge of any long night or long labyrinth of our own, can ever fully know what still waits ahead either. We can only take the next careful step, the same patient way Theseus once did, one hand steady on whatever thread we happen to be holding on to. There is nothing more this story is going to ask you to follow closely now. Let your breathing settle into its own slow, natural rhythm. Let your whole body sink heavier into the bed beneath you. The same unhurried heaviness that settles over any long story finally reaching its end. If your mind is still holding on to small pieces of tonight's journey, a torchlit corridor, a golden thread, a crown of stars, let them soften now, blur gently at the edges the way every detail eventually blurs on the way toward true deep rest. If tonight's story helped ease you towards sleep, remember that Boring History Narrative uploads a new one exactly like this every single week. Always this same slow, unhurried pace, always built for exactly this moment. Late at night, mind finally slowing down after a long day. A subscription costs nothing at all and means a new story will always be waiting the next time you need one. There's no need to remember any of tonight's details by morning. No need to do anything else at all, except let this be the last thing your mind holds on to tonight. Sleep well, rest completely, and good night.